Pain was the first sensation, a dull, throbbing ache behind his eyes that pulsed with each heartbeat. Max tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, weighed down by silken sheets and a body that wasn't his own. He opened his eyes to a canopy of deep crimson velvet embroidered with golden thread depicting dragons coiled around swords. The air smelled of incense, sandalwood and myrrh, with an undercurrent of something metallic, like old blood. Memories flooded in, not as a gentle stream but as a torrential downpour that threatened to drown him. He saw a throne room stained with the blood of dissidents, heard the screams of peasants as their villages burned, felt the cold satisfaction of executing a rival duke with his own hands. And a name echoed through it all, Cassian. Emperor Cassian the Bloody, ruler of the Aurelian Empire, hated by his subjects, distrusted by his nobles, and destined to die in exactly 1 year when his own generals would poison his wine during the sunset feast. Cassian now, sat up slowly, his muscles protesting. He looked at his hands. They were large, scarred across the knuckles, with fingers that looked capable of crushing a man's windpipe. A mirror stood across the chamber, framed in dark wood carved with scenes of conquest. He saw a man in his late 30s with sharp cheekbones, a neatly trimmed beard that couldn't hide a cruel mouth, and eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue and utterly cold. This was the face of a tyrant. The chamber door opened without a knock. 2 servants entered, their heads bowed so low their chins nearly touched their chests. They carried trays, one with a silver goblet of wine, the other with a basin of water and cloths. "Your Majesty," the first servant murmured, his voice trembling. "General Forlac awaits in the antechamber. He brings the morning reports." Cassian watched them. The servant offering the wine had a slight twitch in his left eye. The other kept glancing at the door as if expecting someone. When they bowed, he caught the barest flicker of a sneer on the wine-bearer's lips before it vanished into subservience. These men despised him. Everyone in this palace probably did. Then it happened. A translucent blue rectangle materialized before his eyes, hovering in the air like a phantom screen. Golden text scrolled across the top, .zye interface, initialized. Below it, data began to populate. Loyalty metrics. Capital City, 15%. Palace Staff, 8%. Imperial Guard, 22%. Nobles Council, 3%. Active quests. Sunset Conspiracy, 364 days remaining. Objective, survive the assassination plot. Cassian's breath caught. The interface, it was real. He'd spent thousands of hours staring at screens like this in Civilization 6, min-maxing cities, optimizing trade routes, planning wars 10 turns ahead. But this wasn't a game. The numbers were horrifying. 15% loyalty in his own capital. That wasn't just discontent, that was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The interface flickered, and a pulsing golden marker appeared over the antechamber door, labeled with General Forlac's name. Cassian focused on it, and a new prompt appeared, plot detection available, activate. Cost, minor mental strain. He thought, yes, and a sharp pain lanced through his temples, brief but intense. The interface updated instantly. Plot detection results. Subject, General Forlac. Involvement, Sunset Conspiracy, Primary Coordinator. Current action, delivering poisoned wine via servant Kalen. Additional notes, plans to mobilize loyal troops within palace after confirmation of death. Cassian's heart hammered against his ribs. So it began today. Not in a year, right now. The wine-bearer, Kalen, stood frozen, the goblet extended. The liquid inside looked like any other red wine, but the interface now showed a tiny skull icon floating above it. Poisoned, nightshade extract. Leave the wine, Cassian said, his voice deeper and rougher than he remembered. I feel unwell. Tell General Forlac I will see him shortly. The servants exchanged glances. Kalen's hand tightened on the tray. Your Majesty, General Forlac insisted. I said leave it. Cassian snapped, putting all the imperial authority he could muster into the words. The servants flinched, placed the trays on a nearby table, and scurried out. Alone, Cassian approached the goblet. The interface helpfully provided details, nightshade extract, lethal dose, symptoms, paralysis then cardiac arrest within 10 minutes. He poured it into a chamber pot, watching the dark liquid soak into the porcelain. His hands were steady. Oddly steady. Some part of Cassian the Bloody remained in this body, the part that didn't panic when death approached. He dressed himself in the clothes laid out, black trousers, a crimson tunic embroidered with silver thread, boots that came to his knees. Each movement felt practiced, muscle memory from a life he hadn't lived. As he fastened a cloak around his shoulders, he activated the interface's morale scan ability, focusing on the antechamber. Another spike of pain, milder this time. Morale scan, Imperial Guard Unit 7. Loyalty to Emperor, 22%. Loyalty to General Forlac, 41%. Primary concerns, unpaid wages, poor rations, fear of purge. Suggestions, immediate payment, promise of reform. Cassian pushed open the chamber door. The antechamber was smaller than his bedroom, with stone walls hung with tapestries of battles long past. 6 guards stood at attention, their armor polished but worn at the edges. General Forlac stood before them, a bear of a man with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that missed nothing. He wore the uniform of the Imperial Army, medals clinking on his chest. "Your Majesty," Forlac said, bowing just deep enough to be respectful without being subservient. "I trust you are feeling better." Cassian ignored him. He walked to the center of the room, the interface still glowing in his vision. He focused on the guards, one by one. Their loyalty bars hovered above their heads, mostly yellow, dipping into orange. One, a younger man with a fresh scar across his cheek, showed 35% loyalty to the Emperor, the highest in the room. "Guards," Cassian said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "General Forlac has been plotting treason. He attempted to poison me this morning." Silence. Forlac's face went pale, then flushed red. "Your Majesty, this is..." "Arrest him," Cassian continued, looking directly at the scarred guard. "For treasonous thoughts and actions against the crown." The guards hesitated. Forlac took a step back, his hand moving toward his sword. The interface flashed, loyalty shift detected, guards uncertain. Cassian activated morale scan again, pushing it toward the hesitant men. The mental strain made his vision blur for a second, but the data came through. Morale scan, Imperial Guard Unit 7, real-time. Current state, conflicted. Key factors, fear of Forlac's retaliation, 68%, distrust of Emperor's motives, 72%, desire for stability, 89%. Cassian changed tactics. "The general has been diverting your wages," he said, the words coming out cold and certain. "He's been feeding you rotten rations while dining on roasted pheasant. He plans to purge anyone loyal to me after my death. Arrest him now, and I will see your back pay delivered by sunset. Refuse, and you join him in the dungeons." The scarred guard moved first. He drew his sword, not at Cassian, but at Forlac. "You heard His Majesty," he said, his voice tight. 2 others followed, then the rest. Forlac roared, reaching for his own blade, but they were on him before he could draw it. They pinned his arms behind his back, the general struggling like a trapped animal. "You fool!" Forlac screamed at Cassian. "The others know. They'll come for you. The Sunset Conspiracy will." One of the guards shoved a gag in his mouth. They dragged him toward the door, his boots scraping against stone. Forlac's eyes burned with hatred, fixed on Cassian until he disappeared down the corridor, his screams muffled but still audible. Cassian stood alone in the antechamber, breathing heavily. The interface updated, quest update, Sunset Conspiracy, General Forlac neutralized. But new alerts flashed urgently. Resource shortage detected. Food, 30 days remaining. Causes, poor harvest, noble hoarding, inefficient distribution. Loyalty update. Capital City, 14%, trending down. Peasant class, 11%, critical. He walked to the window, pushing open the heavy shutters. Morning light flooded in, harsh and revealing. Below, spread out beyond the palace walls, was the capital city of Aurelia. From this height, it should have looked majestic, sprawling streets, towering cathedrals, the river winding through like a silver ribbon. Instead, Cassian saw smoke rising from too many chimneys too early in the day, heard the distant sound of shouting, and saw a crowd gathering at the palace gates. The interface zoomed in, though Cassian hadn't commanded it to. It highlighted the crowd, showing hundreds of loyalty bars, almost all of them red, dipping into single digits. They carried crude signs he couldn't read from this distance, but the interface translated, signs detected, bread or blood, down with the tyrant, feed our children. As he watched, the crowd swelled. More people joined from side streets, their anger a palpable wave even from this height. The palace guards at the gates shifted nervously, their hands on their weapons. Cassian's own reflection ghosted over the scene in the window glass, the face of Emperor Cassian the Bloody, who had 1 year to live, who had just arrested his most dangerous traitor, and who now looked down at a city starving and ready to burn. The interface flashed one final alert, pulsing red. Crisis imminent, food riot forming. Recommended action, address resource shortage within 7 days or loyalty will collapse. Cassian leaned against the stone windowsill, the cold seeping through his clothes. He had survived the first move. But the board was still set against him, and the clock was ticking. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the throne room, casting fractured patterns of crimson and gold across the marble floor. Cassian sat on the obsidian throne, his fingers tracing the cold stone armrests as he watched the translucent interface hovering before his eyes. The numbers were stark: food reserves, 30 days, capital loyalty, 17%, noble council loyalty, 8%. Each metric pulsed with a faint, ominous glow. A dozen nobles filed into the chamber, their silk robes rustling like dry leaves. Lord Malthus, a man with a silver beard and eyes that never quite met Cassian's, led the procession. The interface tagged each one with floating names and loyalty percentages that dipped into single digits. Malthus's read, loyalty, 3%, with a subtext notation, deceit detected, resource hoarding. Your Majesty, Malthus began, his voice smooth as oil. The food shortage threatens to plunge the empire into chaos. We propose an emergency tax increase, 20% on all grain stores in the capital. This will allow us to purchase supplies from neighboring territories. Cassian's eyes narrowed. The interface flashed a new alert, plot detection active, council proposal analysis. Lines of text scrolled across his vision, objective, use tax funds to secure personal stockpiles while blaming shortage on royal incompetence. Estimated timeline, 45 days until palace coup attempt. He leaned forward, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than before. And where exactly would these supplies come from, Lord Malthus? Why, from the fertile valleys of the western marches, Your Majesty. They have surplus harvests this season. Another alert, resource node vision available, cost, minor neural strain. Cassian focused, and a sharp headache bloomed behind his temples. The world shifted, the throne room faded slightly, replaced by translucent overlays of terrain. He saw the western marches Malthus mentioned, but the interface colored them, resource status, depleted, noble-controlled lands overfarmed. Then his vision swept eastward, beyond the council's maps, to where the interface highlighted patches of vibrant green, untapped fertile lands, eastern wildlands, soil quality, 98%, estimated yield, 12,000 bushels/month. Interesting, Cassian said, his voice calm despite the pounding in his skull. But I've reviewed the agricultural reports. The western valleys are exhausted. Their yields have dropped 40% over the last 3 seasons. Malthus's smile tightened. With respect, Your Majesty, our stewards assure us. Your stewards are lying, Cassian interrupted. He stood, the interface prompting him with, direct inspiration skill available, requirement, charisma check versus audience disposition. He took a breath, feeling the tyrant's memories of countless speeches surface, the bluster, the fear, the hollow authority. But Max's gaming instincts overlaid them, calculating angles of approach like moving pieces on a strategy board. He walked down the dais steps, ignoring the nobles' murmurs. The interface displayed real-time loyalty shifts, noble council, 5% 2%, palace guards, 45% 50%. The guards along the walls stood straighter, their eyes following him. You speak of taxes, Cassian said, his voice carrying through the vaulted chamber. But taxes feed bureaucracy, not people. You speak of purchases, but gold doesn't grow crops. He reached the great doors leading to the balcony overlooking the palace courtyard. Beyond, he could see the mob from yesterday, smaller now, but still present, their loyalty bars hovering at, peasant loyalty, 10%. The interface prompted, charisma check, use interface data for persuasion. Cassian pushed the doors open. Morning light flooded in, and the murmur of the crowd grew louder. He stepped onto the balcony, the nobles trailing behind like confused shadows. Below, hundreds of faces looked up, farmers in worn tunics, merchants with anxious eyes, mothers holding thin children. Cassian's interface scanned them, average nutrition level, low, primary concern, food security, secondary concern, land rights. People of the capital. Cassian called out, his voice amplified by the balcony's acoustics. The interface provided subtitles of his words in his vision, along with loyalty metrics that began to tick upward: peasant loyalty, 10%, 15%. You hunger. Your children hunger. And my council offers you taxes. A ripple of discontent moved through the crowd. Cassian focused, and the interface projected a holographic map onto the air before him, visible only to him, but he gestured as if pointing to real terrain. But I offer you land. He described the eastern wildlands the interface had revealed, using exact numbers: soil with 98% fertility. Land that can yield 12,000 bushels of grain per month. Land that has never been touched by noble tax collectors. The loyalty metrics jumped: peasant loyalty, 15%, 35%. Murmurs turned to shouts of approval. Cassian continued, layering promises with specifics from the interface: every family that works those lands will keep 70% of their harvest. The rest goes to imperial granaries to feed the cities. No middlemen. No hidden levies. Behind him, Lord Malthus sputtered. Your Majesty. Those lands are beyond our secured borders. They're unprotected. Then we'll protect them, Cassian said without turning. The interface highlighted a military unit: 3rd Imperial Legion, location, Northern Garrison, loyalty, 65%, commander, Captain Rylan. He issued a mental command through the interface: redirect, 3rd Legion to Eastern Wildlands, priority, secure fertile zones. An acknowledgement pinged back: order received. Estimated march time, 6 days. Cassian addressed the crowd again, his headache receding as the resource node vision faded. In 1 week, Imperial surveyors will mark the plots. In 2, seeds will be distributed from the royal stores. He didn't mention those stores were nearly empty. The interface showed seed reserves, 8 days, but he'd worry about that later. The peasants' loyalty bars now glowed amber instead of red: peasant loyalty, 35%, 55%. Cheers erupted, tentative at first, then growing. Cassian watched as the interface updated: capital loyalty, 17%, 40%, food crisis timeline extended, 30 days, 45 days. He turned back to the nobles. Their loyalty metrics had plummeted: noble council, 2%, 0%. Lord Malthus's face was pale. You bypass the council. You give imperial lands to peasants. They're not your lands to give or withhold, Cassian said quietly. They're the Empire's. And the Empire is starving. He walked past them, back into the throne room. The interface logged the event: reform enacted, land redistribution. Stability impact, +15. For the next 6 days, Cassian worked through the interface, micromanaging the Legion's march, coordinating with what loyal bureaucrats remained to prepare seed distributions, and ignoring a dozen petitions from outraged nobles. He slept in short bursts, the interface always active, monitoring loyalty shifts and resource counts. On the 7th day, as dawn broke, a messenger arrived from the east. Cassian stood in the war room, map spread across a heavy oak table. The messenger, a young soldier with dust on his uniform, saluted. Your Majesty, the 3rd Legion has secured the eastern wildlands. No resistance encountered. Captain Rylan reports the soil is, it's like nothing we've seen. Rich and dark. Cassian nodded, the interface confirming, eastern wildlands, secured. Resource node active. He could almost smell the turned earth through the data stream. Begin planting immediately. Use the accelerated rotation patterns I outlined. The soldier bowed and left. Cassian turned to the window, watching the first light touch the palace spires. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than tension, a flicker of satisfaction. The food crisis would be alleviated. The peasants' loyalty was rising steadily: peasant loyalty, 55%, 68%. The nobles were furious but silent, their plots temporarily disrupted. Then the interface pinged, a sharp, urgent sound he hadn't heard before. A new alert flashed crimson in the corner of his vision: strategic reconnaissance alert, army movement detected. He focused, and the map overlay expanded, zooming westward beyond his borders. Icons appeared: Kingdom of Viridia, force composition, 5,000 infantry, 1,000 cavalry, movement vector, eastward, estimated time to border, 20 days. Cassian's breath caught. The interface provided additional data: Viridian loyalty to Cassian, -100%, ruler, King Alaric, known objectives, contain imperial expansion. He stared at the moving icons, their progression marked by pulsing red arrows. His expansion, the seizure of the wildlands, the redirecting of troops, had drawn attention far sooner than he'd anticipated. He leaned on the map table, his knuckles white. The room felt suddenly colder. Beyond the window, the Empire slept, unaware that its first harvest might coincide with its first war. The war room was a cavernous space of dark stone and flickering torchlight, its air thick with the scent of old parchment and cold sweat. Emperor Cassian stood over a massive oak table, his fingers tracing the ink lines of a map that sprawled across its surface. The God's Eye interface hovered before his eyes, a translucent overlay of glowing data that painted reality with numbers and colors. Viridia's troop movements pulsed in angry red arrows, snaking eastward toward his newly claimed lands, 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. The interface estimated their arrival in 18 days now, a relentless countdown ticking in the corner of his vision. Cassian's generals clustered around the table, their faces etched with worry. General Arcturus, a grizzled veteran with a scar across his cheek, pointed a calloused finger at the map. "Your Majesty, we must fortify the eastern border. The 3rd Legion is spread thin securing the fertile lands. If Viridia strikes, we'll be overrun." His voice was gravelly, edged with the fatigue of too many lost battles under the old tyrant's reign. Cassian could see the loyalty bars above each general's head. Arcturus's glowed a cautious green at 65%, while others flickered in yellows and oranges, none above 70%. The morale scan ability whispered their doubts, fear of overextension, distrust of sudden changes. But Cassian's mind, sharpened by years of Civilization VI campaigns, saw not a threat but an opening. He zoomed in on the interface's strategic map, his eyes narrowing. The data streamed, terrain elevations, resource nodes, enemy patrol patterns. Viridia's army moved along a predictable route, hugging the southern plains. To the north, the Iron Fang Mountains rose in jagged peaks, marked on the map as impassable by conventional wisdom. Yet, the resource node vision skill tingled at the edges of his consciousness, highlighting a faint shimmer in those mountains. Iron ore, untapped and rich, buried beneath a narrow pass the cartographers had labeled the Serpent's Throat. He focused, activating the strategic reconnaissance skill. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a moderate focus drain that made the torchlight blur for a moment. The interface consumed his mental energy, pulling data from unseen scouts, wind patterns, and distant echoes. The pass materialized in his mind's eye, a treacherous defile, yes, but undefended. Viridia had left it bare, assuming the terrain was defense enough. Cassian's lips curled into a thin smile. In his gaming days, he'd won wars by seizing such choke points, turning geography into a weapon. "We will not defend," Cassian declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He straightened, the Emperor's robes heavy on his shoulders. "We will attack. Here." His finger stabbed the map at the Serpent's Throat. The generals stared, disbelief etching their faces. Arcturus sputtered, "Your Majesty, that's madness. The mountains are sheer, the pass is a death trap for large forces." Cassian ignored him, his gaze fixed on the interface. He called up the army's loyalty metrics. The 3rd Imperial Legion, now bolstered by peasant volunteers after the land reforms, glowed a steady green at 82%. High enough. He triggered the morale boost ability, a feature he'd unlocked as loyalty climbed. It wasn't a skill listed in his inventory, but an inherent function of the interface when conditions were met. A warm pulse emanated from him, invisible but palpable. The generals stiffened, their loyalty bars flickering upward by a few points. Arcturus's jumped to 70%, his skepticism softening into wary curiosity. "Assemble the swift-winged cavalry," Cassian ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. 500 riders, light armor, provisions for a week. They move at dawn. He detailed the route, a hidden trail his reconnaissance had revealed, skirting Viridia's scouts. The interface provided real-time updates, enemy patrol schedules, weather forecasts of clear skies, even the morale of Viridia's border garrisons, which dipped low due to supply issues. Cassian felt the familiar thrill of min-maxing, every variable optimized. The night was spent in frantic preparation. Cassian oversaw it from the war room, the interface a constant companion. He watched as resource counts adjusted, iron reserves would spike if the raid succeeded, food stability holding at 45 days thanks to the first harvests from the eastern lands. Peasant loyalty in the capital now read 72%, a steady climb since his balcony speech. But his thoughts kept returning to the nobles, their resentment a cold undercurrent. Lord Malthus had been conspicuously absent from the council meeting, his deceitful aura a blot on the interface's political map. At first light, the swift-winged cavalry assembled in the courtyard, their horses stamping in the chill air. Cassian addressed them from a balcony, the direct inspiration skill humming in his veins. He didn't need grand words, he used data. The serpent's throat holds iron that will arm every soldier in this empire, he said, his voice carrying over the clatter of armor. Viridia thinks us weak. Show them our speed. The interface displayed projected casualty rates, low, if they struck fast, and the riders' loyalty bars gleamed bright green, boosted by the morale effect. They rode out, a stream of steel and determination, vanishing into the dawn mist. For 3 days, Cassian waited, the interface his window to the world. He monitored the cavalry's progress, their icon moving like a ghost through the mountains. Viridia's army continued its plodding march, unaware. In the war room, Cassian pored over supply lines, using resource node vision to identify future expansion sites, a copper deposit to the west, a fertile valley near Loritha's border. The corrupt nobles whispered in shadows, but their plots registered as faint blips, nothing urgent yet. On the 4th day, as the sun set in a blaze of orange, the interface chimed with a victory alert. The serpent's throat was secured. Casualties, minimal. Iron ore captured, substantial, enough to triple weapon production. Cassian allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, leaning back in his chair. The generals, once skeptical, now looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. Arcturus approached, bowing slightly. Your Majesty, the pass is ours. Viridia's army has halted, they're confused, sending scouts north. Cassian nodded, watching the real-time map. Viridia's red arrows had stalled, their formation breaking into disarray. He could almost taste the strategic victory, resources gained, enemy momentum broken. He rose, intending to retire to his chambers, when the interface flashed. Not with the usual gold of success, but with a sinister purple glow. A new warning pulsed at the edge of his vision, hidden plot, the Iron Pact forming. He froze, his breath catching. The map zoomed out, showing not just Viridia but 3 rival kingdoms, Viridia, Lorith, and a third labeled Kaelner, their loyalty metric sinking in a chilling dance. Bars of crimson and amber began to align, pulsing in unison. Text scrolled, diplomatic envoys detected. Alliance cohesion, 40% and rising. Threat level, high. Cassian's hands clenched on the table's edge. The gain from the raid felt hollow suddenly, a small prize in a game that had just expanded its board. He stared at the glowing data, the room fading around him, as the interface whispered of shadows gathering beyond the mountains. The throne room of the obsidian palace felt colder than usual, the morning light filtering through stained glass windows casting fractured patterns across the marble floor. Emperor Cassian sat upon the dragonbone throne, its jagged edges carved from the remains of some ancient beast his predecessor had slain. The God's Eye interface shimmered before him, displaying the usual metrics, peasant loyalty holding steady at 72%, army loyalty at 84%, food stability at 48 days. But new notifications pulsed in the corner of his vision, diplomatic alerts. 3 envoys entered through the grand double doors, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. Cassian didn't need the interface to recognize their arrogance. The first wore Viridia's green and gold, a hawk-nosed man with eyes that never settled. The second displayed Kaelner's silver wolf sigil, his armor polished to a mirror sheen. The third, from Lorith, moved with less certainty, his simpler blue robe seeming almost apologetic beside the others. Your Imperial Majesty, began the Viridian envoy, bowing just shallow enough to be insulting. We come on behalf of the Iron Pact. Cassian's fingers tightened on the throne's armrests. The interface immediately populated their profiles. Lord Tyrant of Viridia, deceit rating 89%. Sir Valerius of Kaelner, aggression rating 94%. And Master Elric of Lorith, anxiety rating 76%, loyalty to pact only 42%. The numbers danced like living things, telling stories their faces tried to conceal. We demand the immediate return of the Serpent's Throat Pass, Tyrant continued, his voice dripping with false diplomacy. And withdrawal from all territories seized beyond your historical borders. In exchange, we offer peace. The word hung in the air like a poisoned fruit. Cassian's plot detection skill activated automatically, highlighting the lies in Tyrant's speech. The interface superimposed red text over the envoy's figure, false promise, actual intent, forced submission. More data streamed, estimated troop movements along the border, supply lines being established, correspondence between the 3 kingdoms showing plans for a coordinated spring offensive. Cassian leaned forward. Peace, he repeated, letting the syllable echo. An interesting concept from those who move armies while speaking of tranquility. Valerius of Kaelner stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Do not test our patience, Emperor. The Iron Pact stands united. Return what you have stolen, or face the consequences. But Cassian's eyes were on Elric of Lorith. The man's interface profile showed flickering numbers, his kingdom's resource reserves critically low, their military strength a mere third of Viridia's, their people suffering from a blight that had ruined last season's harvest. The Loriti envoy kept glancing at his counterparts, his shoulders tense beneath the blue robes. Cassian activated a skill he hadn't used before, Diplomacy Analyzer. A new section of the interface bloomed, showing alliance cohesion metrics. The Iron Pact's unity score, 68%. Not as solid as they pretended. Breakdown showed Viridia dominating decision-making at 47% influence, Kaelner at 38%, Lorith at a pathetic 15%. More importantly, it revealed hidden tensions, disputes over resource sharing, disagreements about military strategy, and most tellingly, Viridia's plans to absorb Loritha's eastern provinces, for mutual defense. The mental strain was immediate, like ice picks behind Cassian's eyes. Processing real-time deceit metrics, alliance weaknesses, and individual motivations required concentration that made his temples throb. But the data was worth the pain. Master Elric, Cassian said, his voice cutting through Valerius's bluster. Your people are starving. The Loriti envoy flinched. That is. Your grain stores are at 12% capacity, Cassian continued, reading directly from the interface. The blight in your southern farmlands destroyed 70% of your winter wheat. And your so-called allies, he gestured to Tyrant and Valerius, have offered you nothing but empty promises while planning to annex your most fertile remaining lands. Tyrant's face darkened. These are lies. Are they? Cassian stood, the heavy imperial robes swirling around him. The interface highlighted the exact documents, intercepted messages, supply reports, even the proposed treaty clauses that would effectively make Lorith a vassal state. I have the correspondence. Viridia's Minister of Agriculture writing to your king, offering assistance in exchange for administrative control of the riverlands. Kaelner's military advisor suggesting joint garrisons in your border fortresses. Elric's hands trembled. The interface showed his anxiety spiking to 89%, his loyalty to the pact plummeting to 28%. Cassian descended the dais steps, his boots clicking on marble. He stopped before Elric, close enough that only the Loriti envoy could hear his next words. I can offer what they cannot, he murmured. Not empty alliances, but real aid. My resource node vision shows untapped silver veins in the mountains your people consider cursed. My agricultural records from the eastern wildlands contain blight-resistant seed strains. And my armies, he glanced at Tyrant and Valerius, are positioned to protect, not conquer. The interface displayed the offer in quantified terms, shared mining rights, Lorith 60%, Cassian's empire 40%, agricultural technology transfer, mutual defense pact with clearly defined borders. Cassian watched Elric's metrics shift, consideration rising, fear of Viridia's retaliation still present but weakening. You would betray the pact. Tyrant snarled, finally understanding the private conversation. Betrayal implies loyalty existed, Cassian said, turning back to the other envoys. Your alliance was always a knife aimed at my throat. I'm merely removing one of the blades before it strikes. He raised his voice so the entire court could hear. Guards! Bring the documents from my study, the blue leather folio. Moments later, a soldier returned with a thick bundle of papers. Cassian took them, then deliberately walked to a brazier burning near the throne. The flames danced, hungry. These, he said, holding up the papers, contain every secret your kingdom's thought hidden. Viridia's plans to dominate the pact. Kaelner's agreements with mercenary companies to raid Loriti caravans. The full extent of your deception. He didn't throw them in. Instead, he handed them to a scribe. Copy these. Distribute them to every court in the continent. Let the world see the Iron Pact's true nature. Valerius drew his sword halfway. Imperial guards immediately stepped forward, their own blades ringing from scabbards. The interface showed their loyalty bars, all green, all high. Cassian had made sure of that with back pay, fair treatment, and the morale boost he'd been carefully applying since taking the throne. You'll regret this, Tyrant spat, his composure finally shattered. Perhaps, Cassian said. But you'll regret it more. He turned to Elric. Master Envoy, my offer stands. Return to your king with these terms. He handed the Loriti a sealed scroll, the interface had helped craft the perfect wording, balancing generosity with strategic advantage. The choice is yours: remain with those who would devour you, or join an empire that values true partnership. Elric took the scroll, his hands steadier now. He bowed, deeper than protocol required. "I will convey your words exactly, your majesty." As the envoys were escorted out, Varen and Valerius fuming, Elric walking with newfound purpose, Cassian returned to his throne. The mental fatigue from using diplomacy analyzer was receding, replaced by the satisfaction of a gambit well played. The interface updated, iron-packed cohesion now 41% and dropping. Loritha's status changed to neutral negotiating. Viridia and Kaelner showed increased military readiness, but their coordination metrics had fractured. He allowed himself a moment to watch the sunlight move across the floor. The immediate crisis was averted, the alliance broken before it could fully form. But the game was far from over. A new alert flashed crimson across his vision. Assassination attempt detected. Object, ornate jeweled box. Contents, toxic markers identified, nightshade extract, phantom root. Delivery method, gift presentation. Cassian's head snapped up. A servant he didn't recognize, not Kalen, this was someone new, was approaching the throne, holding a lacquered box inlaid with mother of pearl. The young man's interface profile showed deception rating 67%, but more importantly, the box itself glowed with sickly green markers on Cassian's HUD, toxic symbols pulsing like a heartbeat. "Your Majesty," the servant said, bowing. "A gift from admirers in the eastern provinces. They wished to express their gratitude for your reforms." The lie was obvious even without the interface. Cassian's plot detection highlighted the servant's micro-expressions, the too quick blink, the slight tremble in his hands, the way his eyes avoided direct contact. "Set it there," Cassian said, pointing to a table well away from himself. The servant hesitated. "Would you not like to open it, Your Majesty? The craftsmanship is—" "I said set it down." The command held imperial steel. The servant flinched, then carefully placed the box on the indicated table. As he straightened, Cassian activated morale scan. The servant's loyalty bar appeared, a thin sliver of yellow at 23%, surrounded by red warning indicators. Not just a pawn, then. Someone with their own reasons. "What is your name?" Cassian asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Jorin, Your Majesty." "And who gave you this box, Jorin?" The servant's deception rating jumped to 79%. It was delivered to the palace gates. No name was attached. Another lie. The interface showed the truth in data streams, a middle-aged woman in noble dress, handing the box to Jorin in a shadowed corridor, exchanging whispered words. Cassian's memory supplied the face, Lady Selene, wife of Lord Malthus. The corrupt noble wasn't finished with his games. Cassian stood. Guards. 4 soldiers stepped forward instantly. "Take Jorin to the interrogation chambers. Gently, he's more valuable alive. Then, pointing to the box, and have the alchemists examine that. Tell them to wear protective gloves." As Jorin was led away, protesting his innocence, Cassian approached the table. The box seemed innocent enough, beautiful, even. But on his HUD, it pulsed with venomous light. Nightshade extract. Phantom root. Both slow-acting, both virtually undetectable to normal senses. Open the box, inhale the powder coating the gift inside, and within hours, he'd be dead of apparent natural causes. Clever. And proof that while he'd been playing the grand game of kingdoms, the knives were still being sharpened much closer to home. He looked out the window where the envoys' carriages were disappearing down the palace road. The Iron Pact was broken, but the war for his survival had just entered a new, more intimate phase. And somewhere in the shadows of his own court, Lord Malthus was smiling. The jeweled box sat on the marble table, its intricate silver filigree catching the morning light that streamed through the palace windows. Emperor Cassian, Max's consciousness sharp behind those imperial eyes, didn't touch it. Instead, his gaze fixed on the translucent overlay that hovered at the edge of his vision. The God's Eye interface pulsed with new data as he mentally activated the item scan skill. A cascade of information flooded his perception. The box itself was ordinary enough, cedar wood from the southern forests, crafted by artisans in Viridia. But the contents, his interface highlighted them in warning crimson. Nightshade extract, concentration 92%, lethal dosage within 30 minutes of skin contact. Phantom root powder, ground fine enough to be inhaled from the velvet lining. Both substances glowed with toxic markers in the spectral analysis his interface provided. The servant Jorin had bowed and retreated, his deception rating still showing 67% in Cassian's peripheral vision, but the real threat was the network behind him. Cassian's fingers tightened on the armrest of his throne. The air in the throne room felt suddenly thick, the scent of incense from morning rituals now carrying the metallic tang of danger. He could see the palace staff moving through the corridors in his interface's minimap, dozens of yellow dots representing neutral loyalty, a handful of green for loyalists, and, there, 3 red dots. Infiltrators. Not just Jorin. The Sunset Conspiracy had threads woven deep into his own household. Your Majesty. General Arcturus's voice cut through his concentration. The grizzled veteran stood at attention by the war table, his loyalty metric a steady 89% in Cassian's display. The envoys have departed. Shall I lock down the palace? Cassian said, his voice colder than he intended. He rose, the heavy imperial robes swirling around him. No one enters or leaves. Secure all exits. Now. The order rippled through the throne room like a shockwave. Guards snapped to attention, their armor clattering as they moved to positions. But Cassian saw what the interface showed before anyone else could react, panic metrics among the staff spiking from 12% to 47% in seconds. Yellow dots turned orange as fear spread. A scullery maid dropped a tray in the western corridor, the crash echoing through stone halls. A scribe in the archives froze, his loyalty dipping from 54% to 31% as suspicion took hold. Cassian strode to the war table, his mind racing. The interface displayed real-time data streams, loyalty percentages for every named staff member, movement patterns, recent interactions cross-referenced with plot detection logs. Lady Celine's involvement was confirmed, her connection to Lord Malthus glowed with conspiracy markers. But she was just one node. The web spread wider. He placed his palms flat on the map of his empire. The capital city glowed at the center, its loyalty metric at a precarious 38%. Food stability showed 45 days remaining. Iron reserves from the Serpent's Throat Pass were being processed. But none of that mattered if assassins could walk his halls freely. Activate Loyalty Purge, Cassian commanded the interface silently. The system responded immediately. A new overlay unfolded across his vision, a complex grid of every palace staff member, their loyalty percentages, their recent movements, their connections to known conspirators. The skill required high authority to function, and Cassian felt the weight of his imperial title like a physical force as the interface began cross-referencing thousands of data points. Recent plot data from the Sunset Conspiracy investigation merged with real-time loyalty metrics. Patterns emerged in crimson highlights. Jorin, of course. His deception rating had spiked to 79% after delivering the box. But there were others. Ilara, the head chambermaid, showed a loyalty of 22% despite her decade of service. Her brother was in General Forlak's arrested faction. Tomas, a guardsman in the East Wing, had visited Lady Celine's quarters 3 times in the past week, his loyalty plummeting from 68% to 41% during those visits. A cook named Bren had received unexplained gold payments that correlated with Viridian diplomatic arrivals. Cassian began issuing orders, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Arrest Ilara from the linen chambers. Detain guardsman Tomas at post 7. Bring the cook Bren from the kitchens for questioning. General Arcturus moved with military precision, dispatching squads. Cassian watched through the interface as red dots were surrounded by green loyalist guards. The arrests happened swiftly, a gasp from a corridor, the clatter of dropped belongings, the firm but not brutal handling of suspects. He made sure of that. The interface showed the reactions of other staff, some loyalty metrics improved as they saw justice being served, others dipped further into fear. By midday, 37 staff members were in custody. The throne room had become a temporary interrogation center, with scribes recording confessions as Cassian used his morale scan ability to detect lies. The web unraveled further. Lady Celine had recruited not just through gold, but through blackmail, threatening family members, exploiting debts. Lord Malthus's involvement was deeper than Cassian had realized, the noble had provided access codes to palace storage rooms where poisons could be hidden. As the sun reached its zenith, Cassian instituted the new security protocol. Every staff member would wear a token enchanted to interface with his God's Eye system, not to read thoughts, but to monitor location and vital signs. Any abnormal movement patterns, any attempts to access restricted areas, any contact with known conspirators would trigger immediate alerts in his interface. He demonstrated the system himself, showing how a green dot would turn yellow with warning, then red if threats were detected. The effect was immediate. The panic metrics among remaining staff dropped from 47% to 19%. Loyalty in the capital city began climbing in his interface display, 40%. 42%. 45%, as people saw order being restored. By evening, it stabilized at 50%, still precarious, but the highest it had been since his reincarnation. With the immediate threat contained, Cassian turned to the deeper sickness in his empire. He summoned the resource overseers to the throne room. The interface's resource optimization skill activated as he studied the distribution networks. Food from the newly secured eastern wildlands was being harvested, the first crops coming in faster than expected thanks to the direct inspiration he'd given the peasant farmers. But the distribution was inefficient, bottlenecked by noble-controlled checkpoints. Reroute all grain shipments through the imperial highways, Cassian ordered, his fingers tracing new routes on the map. Bypass Lord Malthus's toll stations. Use the 3rd Legion to escort convoys directly to distribution centers. He could see the numbers shifting in real time. Food stability climbed, 45 days became 52, then 58 as efficient distribution reached starving villages. Peasant loyalty, which had plateaued at 72%, began ticking upward again, 73%. 75%, as full bellies replaced hollow promises. In the capital, rumors of the fair distribution spread through the markets, and Cassian watched the loyalty metric nudge to 51%. Night fell, and torches were lit throughout the palace. Cassian stood alone in the war room, the map of the continent spread before him. The Iron Pact's remaining members, Viridia and Kaelner, glowed with hostile intent on his interface. Their troop movements showed increased aggression along the borders. But something new was happening in his own empire's data stream. A notification pulsed in his vision, tech breakthrough unlocked. He focused on it, and the interface expanded the information. Siege engineering. The captured iron from Serpent's throat, combined with engineering knowledge from loyal craftsmen and the strategic data his interface provided, had catalyzed a leap in military technology. Schematics unfolded in his mind, improved trebuchets with counterweight systems, mobile siege towers with reinforced plating, battering rams with iron-capped heads. The designs were more advanced than anything this world had seen, a fusion of medieval engineering and the optimized efficiency his gaming mind understood. Cassian's eyes moved across the map. Viridia's capital, fortified behind mountain passes. Kaelner's coastal strongholds with their high walls. Both glowed in aggressive red on his interface. His fingers traced potential invasion routes, supply lines, choke points. The siege engineering breakthrough changed everything. What had been impregnable fortresses were now vulnerable. He could almost hear the ticking clock in his mind. 1 year to avoid assassination. The internal threats were being purged. The homeland was stabilizing. But beyond his borders, the remaining iron-packed kingdoms were gathering their strength. And they would come for him, or he would go to them. The map seemed to pulse with possibility. Cassian's hand hovered over Viridia's territory, then clenched into a fist. The game was entering a new phase. The air in the Imperial siege workshops was thick with the scent of sawdust, hot metal, and sweat. Emperor Cassian stood at the edge of a sprawling courtyard, his eyes scanning the frantic activity before him. Craftsmen hammered at iron plates, engineers scribbled calculations on parchment, and soldiers hauled timber beams under the harsh morning sun. In the corner of his vision, the God's Eye interface glowed softly, its translucent HUD displaying a cascade of data: siege workshop progress, 68%, resource allocation, iron 45%, gold 30%, timber 25%, loyalty, capital city 50%, army 82%, peasant 75%. Cassian's fingers traced the edge of a half-built catapult, its wooden frame groaning as workers tightened ropes. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. Each day brought him closer to the assassination deadline, and each hour wasted was a step toward failure. The interface's plot detection skill had been quiet since the purge, but he knew the silence was deceptive. Rivals like Viridia and Kaelner were not idle, they were gathering strength, and the Iron Pact's cohesion, though weakened to 41%, still posed a threat. A scout, breathless and dust-stained, burst into the courtyard. "Your Majesty," he gasped, bowing low. "Reports from the border. The Iron Pact, Viridia and Kaelner, are massing troops at the Serpent Spine Pass. Their numbers are estimated at 10,000, with cavalry units spotted moving into position." Cassian's jaw tightened. The Serpent Spine was a narrow, defensible choke point, but if the pact broke through, they could march straight into the heartlands of his empire. He activated the strategic reconnaissance skill, and the interface flickered, overlaying a map of the border region. Red icons pulsed where enemy forces congregated, their movements tracked in real time. Enemy composition: infantry 60%, cavalry 25%, siege engines 15%. He noted the lack of advanced tech, no trebuchets or reinforced walls on their side yet. But they had numbers, and time was on their side if he hesitated. "Summon General Arcturus," Cassian ordered, his voice cutting through the workshop noise. The grizzled veteran arrived moments later, his armor clanking as he bowed. "Arcturus, we need to accelerate our defenses. The Pact is testing us with a probing attack. I want the siege workshops at full capacity within 2 days." Arcturus nodded, his weathered face grim. "The men are ready, Your Majesty, but our resources are stretched thin. The iron from Serpent's throat is helping, but gold reserves are dwindling from the security upgrades and food redistribution." Cassian ignored the warning for now. He focused on the interface, activating a skill he had rarely used: resource optimization. The HUD shifted, displaying complex algorithms that rerouted stockpiles, diverting timber from civilian projects to the workshops, prioritizing iron for weapon forging over decorative armor. But it wasn't enough. He needed a breakthrough, something to outpace the Pact's numerical advantage. His eyes landed on a new option in the interface: Tech Tree Acceleration, available. The description flashed: cost, heavy resource allocation from stockpiles. Effect, fast-tracks research on selected technologies, reducing development time by 50%. Warning, may trigger resource shortages. Cassian didn't hesitate. He selected 2 technologies, reinforced walls and trebuchets. The interface word, and progress bars appeared: reinforced walls research, 0%-25%, trebuchets research, 0%-20%. Immediately, he felt a drain: gold reserves dropped by 15%, iron by 10%, and timber by 5%. Workers around him seemed to move faster, their hands blurring as blueprints updated in real time on the interface's shared display. For the next 48 hours, Cassian barely slept. He moved between the workshops and the training grounds, using the interface's combat simulator skill to drill soldiers. The simulator projected holographic enemies onto the dusty field, mimicking Pact tactics based on reconnaissance data. Soldiers practiced forming shield walls, coordinating with archers, and maneuvering around simulated trebuchet fire. Cassian watched, his mind calculating angles and weaknesses. He noted a young lieutenant, named Kalen, who showed exceptional promise. His unit repelled 3 simulated assaults with minimal losses. Cassian made a mental note to promote him later. On the 3rd day, as dawn broke, the attack came. Scouts reported movement at the Serpent's spine, a force of 2,000 Pact soldiers, likely a probing strike to test defenses. Cassian stood on a newly reinforced watchtower, the interface feeding him live data: enemy approach, ETA 30 minutes, allied forces, 1,500 infantry, 300 cavalry, 2 catapults operational. He activated the morale scan ability: army loyalty, 85%, boosted by recent successes and fair treatment. Good. He gave the order through the interface, using the direct inspiration skill to broadcast a brief, rallying message to all units. "Hold the line. We have the tech, we have the strategy. Let them break against our walls." The battle was a blur of noise and motion. Pact soldiers charged up the narrow pass, their shouts echoing off the stone. Cassian's forces, drilled to perfection, responded with disciplined volleys of arrows from elevated positions. The newly built catapults, crude but effective, launched stones that shattered enemy formations. When the Pact cavalry attempted a flanking maneuver, Cassian's interface flagged it, and he redirected reserves to plug the gap. The combat simulator had prepared them for this. Soldiers moved in sync, their movements almost mechanical. Within an hour, the probing attack was repelled. Pact losses were estimated at 300, while Cassian's forces suffered only 50 casualties, mostly minor injuries. The interface updated: victory, minimal losses, border security, increased, Iron Pact cohesion, drops to 38%. Cheers erupted from the walls, and Cassian allowed himself a grim smile. The tech advantage had paid off, the reinforced walls had held without a scratch, and the trebuchet prototypes, though not yet deployed, were nearing completion. But as he descended the watchtower, the interface flashed a warning in bright red: resource drain, gold reserves critical. Cassian's smile vanished. He pulled up the full resource panel: gold, 5%, iron, 35%, timber, 20%, food stability, 58 days. The rapid expansion, the siege workshops, the tech acceleration, it had all cost more than he anticipated. He had been so focused on outmaneuvering the pack that he had neglected the empire's economic backbone. Peasant loyalty might be high, but without gold, he couldn't pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, or fund further research. He walked back to the palace, his steps heavy. The victory felt hollow now, like a shiny blade with a cracked hilt. In his private chambers, he stared at a map of the continent, the interface overlaying resource nodes in faint gold glows. The Iron Pact was weakened, but not broken. Viridia and Kael'ner would regroup, and Loritha's neutrality was fragile. And now, his own empire teetered on bankruptcy. He thought of the assassins still lurking, the plots waiting to unfold. The clock was ticking, and he had just spent his last coin buying time. The interface flickered again, this time with a new alert, incoming diplomatic envoy, Kingdom of Viridia. Purpose, ultimatum. Cassian's hands clenched into fists. The tech race had begun, but the price was steeper than he imagined. The throne room felt colder than usual, the morning light filtering through high-arched windows to cast long shadows across the marble floor. Emperor Cassian sat on the obsidian throne, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest as he stared at the translucent HUD floating before his eyes. The numbers glared back at him, gold reserves, 5%. The crimson warning flashed persistently in the corner of his vision, a silent scream that echoed through the empty hall. He'd spent the night analyzing the data, watching as the Empire's wealth bled away through 100 unseen wounds. The siege workshops consumed iron and timber at alarming rates. The army's payroll drained coffers weekly. And beneath it all, a slow, steady trickle of corruption siphoned off what little remained. Cassian's jaw tightened. In his previous life as Max, he'd managed civilizations with spreadsheets and optimization algorithms. Here, the stakes were his throat and a year's countdown to assassination. Summon the economic advisors, he commanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. Within the hour, 3 men entered the throne room, their robes of fine silk rustling with each step. Lord Ferris, master of coin, led the procession, a portly man with oiled hair and calculating eyes. Behind him came Treasurer Van and Auditor Krell, both wearing expressions of practiced deference. Cassian didn't rise. Instead, he activated the God's Eye interface, the HUD shimmering as it overlaid data across his vision. Loyalty metrics appeared beside each man's name. Ferris, 31%. Van, 28%. Krell, 34%. The numbers hovered in sickly yellow, far below the green safety threshold of 60%. Worse, thin tendrils of connection data spiderwebbed from their profiles, links to merchant guilds, noble houses, even foreign accounts in Viridia and Kael'ner. Cassian's plot detection skill hummed quietly, highlighting discrepancies in their reported figures versus the interface's real-time tracking. Your Majesty, Ferris began with a shallow bow. We have prepared the quarterly report. The treasury situation is challenging, but manageable with modest austerity measures. Cassian leaned forward. Show me the ledgers. Van produced a thick tome, its pages filled with elegant script. Cassian didn't touch it. Instead, he focused his interface, activating the resource optimization skill he'd used before. But this time, he pushed deeper, accessing layers of economic data he hadn't fully explored. The HUD responded, unfolding complex models, tax flow charts, trade route efficiencies, corruption loss projections. A new skill icon pulsed at the edge of his awareness, economic modeling. It required deep interface data analysis, something he now possessed after months of accumulating metrics. He compared the handwritten numbers to the interface's real-time data. Discrepancies appeared immediately. According to your records, Cassian said, his voice dangerously calm, the northern grain tariffs collected 12,000 gold last month. Yes, Your Majesty, Krell nodded. A slight increase from the previous. The interface shows 14,500 collected, Cassian interrupted. Where did the difference go? Silence thickened the air. Ferris's loyalty metric flickered, 30%. 29%. 28%. Sweat beaded on his temple. A recording error, surely. The clerks. The interface doesn't make errors, Cassian stood, the movement sudden and sharp. It tracks every coin that enters imperial coffers. And it shows 3% of all tax revenue disappearing into private accounts. Your accounts. The advisors froze. Cassian watched their loyalty numbers plummet, Ferris to 15%, Van to 12%, Krell to 18%. The plot detection skill activated fully now, revealing hidden connections. Ferris owned 3 merchant ships that mysteriously avoided customs inspections. Van had purchased a country estate with funds marked for road repairs. Krell's daughter's dowry matched exactly the missing silver from the southern mines. Rage, cold and precise, settled in Cassian's chest. This wasn't just theft, it was sabotage while the Empire stood on the brink of war and collapse. "You've been skimming funds since the day I took the throne," he said, each word measured. "Perhaps before. Feeding your coffers while the army goes underpaid and peasants starve." "Your Majesty, we can explain," Ferris began, his voice trembling. "Guards." The doors burst open as armored soldiers entered, General Arcturus at their lead. The grizzled veteran's hand rested on his sword hilt, his loyalty metric a steady 88% in Cassian's vision. "Arrest them," Cassian commanded. "Confiscate all their assets. I want every hidden account, every buried chest, every jewel bought with stolen gold." As the guards dragged the protesting advisors away, Cassian turned to the map table at the room's center. The economic crisis required more than removing corrupt officials, it demanded systemic overhaul. He activated the economic modeling skill fully, the interface responding with cascading data streams. For hours, he worked alone in the throne room, the HUD projecting complex tax models across his vision. He analyzed historical data, current trade flows, peasant income levels, merchant profit margins. The old system was a patchwork of noble exemptions, arbitrary tariffs, and inefficient collection, a relic of the previous Cassian's neglect and the noble's greed. Cassian designed something new. A progressive land tax based on harvest yields, tracked through interface-linked crop reports. Tariff standardized by commodity type, with reduced rates for essential goods like grain and medicine. A corruption audit system where every transaction would be interface monitored in real time, with discrepancies triggering immediate investigation. But taxes alone wouldn't solve the 5% reserve problem. He needed new revenue streams. Cassian focused his resource node vision skill, the HUD shifting to display the Empire's trade network. Old routes glowed in faint blue, the Silk Road to the east, the Amber Trail north, the Spice Passage south. But between them, like undiscovered veins, shimmered potential routes in pulsing gold. One in particular caught his eye, a mountain pass through the Dragon's Pine Range, previously considered impassable. The interface showed geological data, stable rock formations, gradual inclines, minimal avalanche risk. It connected his western provinces directly to the rich mercantile cities of the free cantons, bypassing Viridia's toll stations entirely. "General Arcturus," Cassian called without turning. The veteran approached. "Your Majesty. Dispatch engineering teams to the western Dragon's Pine. There's a pass here," Cassian pointed at the map, "that can be made traversable with 2 months of work. I want it fortified and patrolled. The mountains are treacherous, sire. And Viridia controls the approaches." "Not for long," Cassian said softly. "And we're not asking permission." Over the following weeks, the Empire transformed. Cassian worked through nights, using the interface to micromanage the economic overhaul. He appointed new officials, young, competent bureaucrats whose loyalty metrics showed green from the start. He implemented the new tax system in phases, starting with the capital region where interface monitoring was strongest. The merchant guilds initially resisted, until Cassian demonstrated the benefits: reduced smuggling losses thanks to interface-audited customs, faster trade approvals through streamlined bureaucracy, and imperial protection for caravans using the new Dragon's Pine route. Their loyalty metrics, which had languished in the 40s, began climbing: 55%, 65%, 72%. Gold reserves responded slowly at first, then surged. 5% became 10%, then 20%, then 35% as recovered stolen assets flooded back into the treasury. The new trade route opened ahead of schedule, its first caravan returning with silks, spices, and gold from the free cantons. Cassian watched the numbers on his HUD with grim satisfaction. The economic engine of his empire was finally turning. One evening, 6 weeks after the advisor's arrest, Cassian stood on his balcony overlooking the capital. The city spread below him, lanterns flickering to life as dusk settled. His interface showed updated metrics: gold reserves 42%, peasant loyalty 78%, merchant class loyalty 75%, food stability 62 days. The treasury crisis had been averted, but the cost showed in the dark circles under his eyes and the constant hum of the HUD in his consciousness. A messenger arrived, breathless from the stairs. "Your Majesty." Urgent news from the border scouts. Cassian turned. The man's loyalty metric showed 81%, a reliable courier from Arcturus's command. Report. The Kingdom of Viridia, it's collapsing, sire. Rebel factions have seized the capital. King Aldrich is dead, his army scattered. The eastern provinces have declared independence, the western lords are fighting each other. Before the messenger finished, Cassian's interface flashed. A crimson alert pulsed across his vision, accompanied by a system notification he'd never seen before: regional power vacuum detected. The map of Viridia fractured into competing factions, their military strength ratings appearing beside each, all weak, all disorganized. Cassian's breath caught. Viridia, the kingdom that had threatened him, massed troops at his border, been part of the Iron Pact now reduced to 38% cohesion. Its collapse wasn't just news. It was an opportunity, a gap in the continent's political armor. He stepped back inside, the messenger forgotten. On the map table, Viridia's territory glowed with potential resource nodes revealed by his node vision: iron deposits in the northern hills, fertile valleys in the south, strategic ports along the coast. All undefended. All ripe for taking. The Iron Pact would respond, of course. Kaelner still stood, and other kingdoms would fear his expansion. But with his economy stabilized, his treasury recovering, and his interface showing him every weakness, Cassian smiled for the first time in days. The game had just changed, and he held the perfect hand. The borderlands of Viridia stretched before Emperor Cassian like a tapestry of smoke and opportunity. From his vantage point atop a low ridge, he watched columns of dark smoke rise from half a dozen villages, their tendrils staining the morning sky. The God's Eye interface shimmered in his vision, painting the landscape with translucent overlays of data. Rebel faction territories glowed in angry reds and oranges, shifting like living organisms as their control fluctuated. Resource nodes, iron mines, granaries, treasury vaults, pulsed with golden markers, some already looted, others still intact and vulnerable. Cassian's horse shifted beneath him, its breath misting in the chill air. Beside him, General Arcturus leaned forward in his saddle, the veteran's weathered face creased with concern. Your Majesty, the scouts report at least 7 major rebel factions fighting each other. The capital's defenses have collapsed, but the countryside is a hornet's nest. I can see that, Cassian murmured, his eyes tracking the interface's real-time updates. Faction strength percentages flickered: Crimson Scythes, 38%, Iron Brotherhood, 27%, Free Viridians, 19%, the rest scattered among minor groups. Loyalty metrics for each showed dangerously low numbers, none above 45%. Perfect conditions for manipulation. Behind them, 5,000 Imperial soldiers stood in disciplined formations, their armor gleaming dully in the overcast light. Cassian had brought a mixed force: heavy infantry for holding ground, light cavalry for rapid movement, and a contingent of engineers with the newly developed trebuchets. The interface's supply line indicators glowed green all the way back to the border, but he knew that would change once they advanced. We should establish a fortified camp here, Arcturus advised, his voice low. Send envoys to assess the situation properly. A rushed advance into that chaos could give us exactly what we need, Cassian interrupted, his gaze fixed on a particular data point. The interface highlighted a rebel leader named Gorvan of the Crimson Scythes, whose loyalty metric showed 42% but had a secondary notation: primary motivation, personal vendetta against Viridian nobility. Another, Lyssa of the Free Viridians, displayed motivation, economic security for peasantry. Cassian dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He gestured for a map to be spread across a folding table his aides had set up. The parchment showed Viridia's territory in detail, but it was the interface's overlay that truly mattered. It showed troop movements as shimmering arrows, resource stockpiles as glowing dots, and rebel-controlled zones as shifting-colored blobs. Look here, Cassian said, pointing to a cluster of 3 cities along the Silver River. The Crimson Scythes hold Riverhaven, but their forces are stretched thin fighting the Iron Brotherhood for the iron mines to the north. Their loyalty to any cause is transactional at best. He activated the diplomacy analyzer skill, and new data streams appeared. Diplomatic capital reserves, 68%. Cost projection for faction manipulation, 15 to 25% per major faction. The interface calculated probabilities: 87% chance of securing Crimson Scythes cooperation with proper incentives, 72% for Free Viridians, only 34% for the more ideologically rigid Iron Brotherhood. We're not going to fight our way through this, Cassian declared, straightening up. We're going to buy our way through. Arcturus's eyebrows rose. Your Majesty. Send riders under flag of truce to Gorvan of the Crimson Scythes and Lyssa of the Free Viridians. Offer them this, autonomy over their current territories, imperial protection from other rebel factions, and a share of the resources we secure. In exchange, they swear loyalty to the Empire and grant our armies passage. And if they refuse? Then we support their enemies instead, Cassian said coldly. The interface shows the Iron Brotherhood would jump at imperial backing against the Crimson Scythes. We play them against each other. As messengers galloped toward the smoking countryside, Cassian turned his attention to logistics. He activated the resource optimization skill, watching as supply route calculations cascaded across his vision. The fastest path to Viridia's capital wasn't the main road, it was a series of secondary trails that bypassed the heaviest fighting. The interface highlighted which rebel checkpoints could be bribed, cost 200 gold each, and which would need to be eliminated. 3 hours later, the first response arrived. Gorvan of the Crimson Scythes would meet at a neutral location, a burned-out manor house halfway between the Imperial camp and Riverhaven. Cassian took 50 guards and rode out immediately, the interface constantly updating threat assessments. Ambush probability, 12%, it showed, then revised to 8%, as his scouts reported Gorvan bringing only 20 men. The manor house stood as a skeleton of blackened timbers, its gardens trampled and littered with debris. Gorvan turned out to be a bear of a man with a thick beard streaked with grey, his armor mismatched but serviceable. His loyalty metric hovered at 41% as Cassian approached. Emperor Cassian, Gorvan said, not bothering with titles. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Your man says you'll let us keep what we've taken. I will, Cassian replied, dismounting. The interface showed Gorvan's deception rating at 31%, low for a rebel leader. Riverhaven and the surrounding lands remain under your control. You collect taxes, maintain order, recruit soldiers. In return, you swear fealty to the Empire, allow Imperial troops passage, and contribute 20% of your resource production to the Imperial treasury. And protection from the Brotherhood? The Iron Brotherhood will be persuaded to look elsewhere. Gorvan studied him for a long moment. The interface tracked micro-expressions, slight relaxation of jaw muscles, indicates acceptance, maintained eye contact, suggests honesty, hand not moving toward weapon, trust building. The Viridian nobles promised us reforms for years, Gorvan said finally. Then they sent soldiers to hang us when we asked for them. Why should I believe you're different? Cassian activated the direct inspiration skill, feeling a slight drain on his diplomatic capital reserves. Because I'm not offering reforms. I'm offering you a kingdom within an empire. Keep your lands, your title, your authority. All I ask is loyalty and a share of the wealth. The alternative is watching the Iron Brotherhood crush you when they realize how thin your lines are stretched. The interface showed Gorvan's loyalty jump to 58% as the man processed this. The rebel leader glanced at his men, then back at Cassian. There's a Viridian treasury vault in Riverhaven. The nobles emptied most of it, but my men found a hidden chamber. Gold, jewels, silks. It's yours if we have a deal. Done, Cassian said without hesitation. By nightfall, similar agreements had been reached with Lyssa of the Free Viridians and 2 smaller factions. The Iron Brotherhood refused all overtures, their loyalty metrics showing fanatical resistance to any imperial influence. So Cassian did exactly what he'd promised Gorvan, he directed imperial forces to support Crimson Scythes' attacks against Brotherhood positions, using the combat simulator skill to predict enemy movements and coordinate strikes. Over the next week, Cassian's army moved through Viridia like water finding cracks in stone. Where diplomacy worked, they passed peacefully, securing resource nodes and strategic positions. Where it failed, they struck with precision, always leveraging rebel factions against each other first. The interface's rapid deployment function allowed him to shift troops with eerie efficiency. When scouts reported the Iron Brotherhood massing near the iron mines, he had 3 companies of Imperial soldiers there within 2 days, supporting Crimson Scythes defenders. At the Silver River crossing, Cassian personally oversaw the engineers building pontoon bridges. The interface showed real-time construction progress, material requirements, and even predicted stress points. As workers hauled timber and lashed ropes, he watched the strategic map update, Viridia's territory slowly shifting from rebel-controlled reds to Imperial purple. Your Majesty, Arcturus said one evening as they camped outside what had been Viridia's second-largest city, now held by Lyssa's Free Viridians under Imperial agreement. We've secured the northern iron mines, the granaries at Greenfield, and 3 treasury vaults. Gold reserves have increased to 68%. But But what? The soldiers are uneasy. They expected a conquest, not this web of agreements. They wonder if these rebels will turn on us once Viridia is fully under our control. Cassian glanced at the interface's loyalty metrics for the absorbed factions. Crimson Scythes, 61%. Free Viridians, 57%. The two smaller groups, 52% and 49%. Not ideal, but stable for now. They won't, Cassian said. Because I'm not leaving Viridia as it was. I'm breaking it apart and rebuilding it as part of something larger. Gorvin keeps Riverhaven, but the Imperial governor I'm installing controls the surrounding region. Lyssa keeps her city, but Imperial tax collectors operate alongside hers. They have autonomy, but not independence. He activated the economic modeling skill, watching as new trade routes formed between former Viridian territories and the Empire proper. The interface projected stability increases within months as economic integration deepened. 2 weeks after crossing the border, Cassian stood in the courtyard of Viridia's royal palace. The building showed signs of looting, smashed furniture, torn tapestries, empty sconces where torches had been ripped from walls, but the structure itself remained intact. The last Viridian loyalists had fled days earlier, taking what remained of the royal treasury with them. In the throne room, Cassian received the formal surrenders. Gorvin knelt first, his Crimson Scythes banner laid at the foot of the dais where Viridia's kings had once sat. Lyssa followed, then the leaders of the smaller factions. The interface updated in real time. Viridia territory absorption, 89% complete. Resource gains scrolled past, plus 12,000 gold, plus 8,000 iron units, plus 45,000 food units, plus 3 strategic cities, plus 7 minor settlements. As the ceremony concluded and the new vassals departed to begin implementing the agreements, Cassian remained in the throne room. The late afternoon light slanted through high windows, illuminating motes of dust stirred up by the day's activity. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. Viridia had fallen with minimal imperial bloodshed, its resources now fueling his growing empire, its territory expanding his reach toward the remaining iron-packed kingdoms. Then the interface pinged, a soft, insistent chime that only he could hear. A new window opened in his vision, stark black with silver text. Hidden plot, the shadow blades activated. Below it, profiles began to flicker into existence, each marked with stealth metrics that danced between 70% and 90%. Names appeared: Silas, class, Master Assassin, last known location, Kaelner, Morwenna, class, Poisoner, affiliation, unknown, Kale, class, Infiltrator, suspected base, free cantons. Their methods listed: targeted eliminations, political destabilization, resource sabotage. And at the bottom, in blood-red text, primary target, Emperor Cassian. Contract status, active. Estimated time to attempt, 30 to 60 days. Cassian's satisfaction evaporated like morning mist. He stood perfectly still as the data scrolled, his mind already calculating defenses, countermeasures, preemptive strikes. The game had just changed again, and the clock was still ticking. The palace was a tomb of shadows when the first warning flickered across Cassian's vision. He'd been studying the God's Eye interface in his private study, the translucent HUD casting a pale blue glow over parchment maps of the newly absorbed Viridian territories. Gold reserves, 68%. Imperial territory expansion, 89%. Peasant loyalty, 78%. Army loyalty, 86%. The numbers told a story of success, but his body remembered the exhaustion that came with constant vigilance. Then the alert appeared, a crimson pulse in the corner of his vision, accompanied by text that made his blood run cold. Plot detection activated. Threat identified, the Shadow Blades. Assassins detected within 200 meters. Count, 3. Status, infiltrating. Cassian froze, his hand hovering over the map where he'd been tracing supply lines. The study was silent except for the crackle of the fireplace and the distant howl of wine through the palace's stone corridors. He activated morale scan, and the interface painted the palace in shades of loyalty, green for loyal guards at their posts, yellow for servants in distant wings, and 3 pulsing red dots moving through the eastern servants' quarters with unnatural precision. They were coming for him. He didn't hesitate. Years of Civilization 6 tournaments had taught him that hesitation meant defeat. Cassian shoved the maps aside and moved to the hidden panel behind his desk, a secret passage installed by the previous emperor, one he discovered through the interface's item scan weeks ago. His fingers found the concealed latch, and the wall slid open with a whisper of stone on stone. As he slipped into the darkness, he heard the first sound of the attack, a soft thump from the corridor outside his study, followed by the choked gasp of a guard. Cassian didn't look back. He descended the narrow staircase, his breathing loud in the confined space. The bunker lay 2 levels below, a fortified room with reinforced doors and its own ventilation system, another interface discovery he'd quietly prepared for exactly this scenario. He reached the bunker and sealed the door behind him, the heavy iron bolts sliding home with satisfying finality. The room was sparse, a cot, a desk, a water cistern, and a single lantern that cast long shadows. But most importantly, it had interface access points he'd installed personally, crystal nodes embedded in the walls that connected to the palace's security network. Cassian activated the God's Eye interface fully, the HUD expanding to fill his vision with data streams. He could see the assassins now, 3 red markers moving through the palace like ghosts. Silas, the master assassin, was already in the main corridor outside the empty throne room. Morwenna, the poisoner, had bypassed the kitchens and was heading toward the residential wings. Kale, the infiltrator, was systematically checking servant quarters, likely searching for informants or hidden passages. Counterintelligence network, Cassian whispered, activating the skill he'd developed over months of interface experimentation. The requirement flashed briefly: security infrastructure, adequate, interface integration, complete. The palace schematics appeared in his mind's eye, overlaid with real-time movement data from loyalty scans of every person within the walls. He watched as the interface began tracking patterns. Silas moved with professional efficiency, avoiding patrol routes Cassian had established weeks earlier. Morwenna paused at intersections, likely checking for chemical traces or hidden traps. Kale moved erratically, his path suggesting he was searching for something specific, perhaps the bunker entrance. Cassian's mind raced. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The assassins would eventually find the bunker, or worse, they'd take hostages or sabotage critical infrastructure. He needed to turn their infiltration against them. He began issuing commands through the interface, his fingers tracing patterns in the air as if manipulating a tactical map. Patrol routes shifted. Guards who showed high loyalty metrics, 85% or above, were redirected to form ambush points. Servants with questionable loyalty were quietly moved to secure areas where they couldn't interfere. Cassian set traps, a corridor that would seal behind Silas once he entered, a pantry where Morwenna's poison ingredients would be replaced with harmless substitutes, a servant's room where Kale would find not information but waiting soldiers. Then he activated Combat Simulator, running scenarios. The interface showed him probabilities: 68% chance Silas would detect a corridor trap, 42% chance Morwenna would notice the ingredient swap, 91% chance Kale would walk into the ambush. Not good enough. Cassian needed to be the bait. He left the bunker, moving through secret passages the interface had mapped during his first weeks as Emperor. The stone walls were cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and old secrets. He emerged in the armory, selecting a light blade and a reinforced leather vest, not imperial regalia, but practical gear for close-quarters combat. As he moved toward the central courtyard where the interface predicted the assassins would converge, he activated plot detection continuously. The red markers showed Silas had bypassed the corridor trap, as predicted. Morwenna had detected the ingredient swap and was now moving more cautiously. Only Kale had fallen for the ambush, his markers showed him engaged in combat with loyal guards. 2 remaining. The courtyard was a moonlit expanse of flagstones surrounded by colonnades. Cassian positioned himself near the central fountain, the sound of falling water masking his breathing. He could see the interface data streaming. Silas was approaching from the north colonnade, Morwenna from the southern gardens. They'd coordinated their attack perfectly. When Silas emerged from the shadows, he moved like liquid darkness. The assassin wore simple black garments that seemed to drink the moonlight, his face obscured by a cloth mask. In his hands were twin daggers that gleamed with a faint, oily sheen. Poisoned, Cassian guessed. Emperor Cassian, Silas said, his voice a raspy whisper. The contract said you'd be in your chambers. Contracts can be wrong, Cassian replied, keeping his voice steady. He activated combat prediction, and the interface showed him probabilities. Silas would feint left, then strike low right with the offhand dagger. Probability, 87%. When Silas moved, Cassian was ready. He parried the feint, then sidestepped the low strike, his own blade scoring a shallow cut across the assassin's forearm. Silas hissed and retreated, his movement suddenly less fluid. You fight better than the report suggested, the assassin said, circling. The reports were about the old Cassian, Cassian said, watching as Morwenna's marker approached from behind. The interface warned him, poisoner detected, 15 meters. Weapon, blow dart. Toxin, nightshade extract. He ducked just as the dart whispered past his ear, embedding itself in a stone column. Morwenna stepped from the garden shadows, her hands already reloading the blowpipe. She was smaller than Silas, dressed in dark green that blended with the foliage, her face pale and sharp-featured. 2 against 1, Cassian said, backing toward the fountain. Hardly sporting. Assassination isn't a sport, Silas replied, and they attacked together. The next minutes were a blur of motion and interface data. Cassian's mind processed probabilities faster than conscious thought could follow. Silas would strike high, 92%, Morwenna would aim for his legs with a poison blade, 76%, the fountain provided cover but limited mobility, assessment, acceptable risk. He moved between them, using the combat prediction skill to anticipate their coordinated attacks, turning their teamwork against them. When Silas lunged, Cassian used the interface's movement tracking to position himself so Morwenna's follow-up strike nearly hit her partner instead. When Morwenna tried to flank him, he activated direct inspiration on a group of guards who'd arrived at the courtyard's edge, boosting their courage so they formed a perimeter that limited her escape routes. But the assassins were professionals. Silas feigned injury, drawing Cassian in, then suddenly reversed his momentum in a move the interface hadn't predicted. The dagger sliced through Cassian's leather vest, drawing blood from his ribs. Pain flared, hot and sharp, and for a moment his concentration wavered. Morwenna seized the opportunity, firing another dart. This one grazed Cassian's shoulder, and he felt immediate numbness spreading from the wound. Nightshade extract, paralytic, not lethal, meant to incapacitate him for the killing blow. He activated resource optimization, directing his body's remaining energy to fight the toxin. The interface showed his vital signs dropping, toxin concentration, 27%. Muscle control, decreasing. Time to full paralysis, 42 seconds. Cassian made a decision. He stopped trying to fight both assassins and focused entirely on Silas, using Combat Simulator to run one final prediction. If he pretended to collapse from the poison, Silas would move in for the kill within 3 seconds, exposing his throat for a fraction of a second. Probability, 94%. He let his knees buckle, dropping toward the flagstones. As predicted, Silas closed the distance, dagger raised for the finishing strike. In that moment of exposure, Cassian thrust upward with all his remaining strength, his blade finding the gap between Silas's ribs. The assassin gasped, blood bubbling from his mask. He staggered back, then collapsed, his body twitching once before going still. Morwenna stared, her blowpipe half raised. Cassian could see the calculation in her eyes, finish the job or flee. The interface showed her loyalty to the guild at 88%, but her self-preservation instinct was rising rapidly. Your contract is void, Cassian said, forcing the words through numb lips. Your master is dead. The shadow blades are finished. He activated Diplomacy Analyzer, and the interface provided talking points, offer clemency in exchange for information. Highlight guild's collapse. Emphasize personal survival. Serve me instead, Cassian continued. Tell me who hired you. Tell me everything about the guild's operations. In return, you live. Morwenna hesitated, then slowly lowered the blowpipe. The contract came through intermediaries, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Gold from Viridian loyalists who escaped your conquest. They wanted you dead before you could consolidate power. Names, Cassian demanded. She provided 3 minor nobles he'd overlooked in the Viridian absorption. The interface confirmed they had fled to neighboring kingdoms, their loyalty metrics showing active hostility. The guild has safe houses in 6 cities, Morwenna continued, her words coming faster now. Caches of weapons, poisons, funds. I can show you everything. Cassian nodded, the motion sending fresh waves of numbness through his body. He activated Loyalty Purge on the remaining Shadow Blades assets Morwenna described, directing guards to raid the locations simultaneously. Over the next hour, as he sat propped against the fountain with the toxin slowly receding from his system, he watched through the interface as the guild was dismantled piece by piece. Safe houses were emptied. Caches were seized. Documents were recovered that detailed not just the Viridian contract, but half a dozen other plots against neighboring rulers, information he could use as diplomatic leverage later. When it was done, the courtyard was filled with guards tending to wounded, carrying away Silas's body, and escorting a subdued Morwenna to the dungeons. General Arcturus arrived, his grizzled face tight with concern. Your Majesty, the general said, kneeling beside him. The healers are coming. The assassins are dealt with, Cassian finished, his voice weak. But it cost us. Check the resource reports. Arcturus helped him to his feet, supporting him as they returned to the study. Cassian collapsed into his chair, his body aching from the fight and the lingering effects of the poison. He activated the God's Eye interface one more time, needing to assess the damage. The numbers were sobering. Gold reserves had dropped from 68% to 52% from the security mobilization and raids. Personal energy was critically low, the constant interface use during the crisis had drained him more than he'd realized. But the immediate threat was gone, shadow blades, neutralized. Assassination plot, resolved. Then his eyes caught a new alert, one that made his exhausted mind snap back to attention. Loyalty metrics update. Noble class, 41%. Trend, plummeting. Cause detected, fear of growing power. Secondary cause, resentment of direct rule. Cassian stared at the numbers, watching as they ticked downward even as he looked, 40%. 39%. The nobles were reacting to tonight's events, but not with gratitude for his survival. They saw a tyrant who personally hunted assassins in his own courtyard, who bypassed their authority with interface-guided commands, whose power was becoming too absolute, too unchecked. And beneath the loyalty metrics, the interface detected something else, whispers. Faint, scattered, but growing. Conversations in noble houses behind closed doors. Messengers riding at night to neighboring estates. Coded letters being drafted. Plot detection, activating. Conspiracy forming, 12% probability. Key figures, multiple noble houses. Objective, unknown. Cassian leaned back in his chair, the weight of exhaustion settling over him like a physical burden. He'd survived the shadow blades, dismantled their guild, secured his immediate safety. But in doing so, he'd awakened a deeper, more insidious threat, one that came not from hired knives in the dark, but from the very people who were supposed to be the pillars of his empire. The moon had set by the time he finally closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. All he could see behind his eyelids were those plummeting loyalty numbers, ticking downward like a clock counting down to his next crisis. The throne room felt colder than usual, the morning light filtering through stained glass windows casting distorted shadows across the marble floor. Emperor Cassian sat motionless, his fingers tracing the armrests of the obsidian throne as his God's Eye interface displayed the unfolding disaster in real time. Duke Malaker's loyalty bar had hit 0 2 hours ago. Now, the man stood before the assembled court, his voice echoing through the cavernous hall with practiced defiance. We demand a return to the proper order. Malaker's silver beard bristled as he gestured toward Cassian. This upstart from nowhere, this pretender who speaks of reforms and fairness, he's gutting the very foundations of our empire. Cassian watched the interface's political overlay. Red markers pulsed around Malaker, 7 other nobles with loyalty below 20%, their private army markers mustering at estates scattered across the central provinces. The numbers were concerning, approximately 5,000 trained soldiers, plus another 3,000 levies. Not enough to threaten the imperial legions directly, but enough to cause significant disruption if they seized key infrastructure. Malaker's voice rose. We will not stand by while our ancestral rights are stripped away. While our lands are taxed to feed peasants who should be grateful for our protection. Cassian felt the familiar cold calculation settle over him. This wasn't about principles, the interface's deceit detection module showed Malaker's corruption metrics at 94%. The man had embezzled enough gold from provincial coffers to fund his rebellion 3 times over. His ancestral rights included monopolies on salt, iron, and grain that had starved entire regions during last year's drought. You speak of foundations, Cassian said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the court. He didn't rise from the throne, but every eye turned to him. Yet I see only rot. Rot you've cultivated for decades. He activated the divide and conquer protocol. The interface began cross-referencing Malaker's financial records with the loyalty metrics of the other rebellious nobles. Cassian's fingers twitched as he selected data packets, evidence of Malaker skimming funds meant for their shared projects, correspondence showing the Duke planning to blame them for failures, records of Malaker's agents sabotaging their harvests to drive up grain prices. Lord Valerius, Cassian said, his gaze shifting to a noble whose loyalty bar hovered at 18%. The man flinched. Your daughter's dowry was paid from the famine relief fund Malaker controlled. The same fund that showed a 70% loss to administrative costs. Valerius's face went pale. The interface showed his loyalty dropping further, then stabilizing as confusion metrics spiked. Cassian continued, methodically exposing each noble's compromised position. Baroness Alara, your son's commission in the Silver Legion was purchased with gold stolen from the road maintenance treasury. The same roads your merchants used to transport goods. He watched the red markers flicker. Some hardened, Malaker's inner circle, too deeply implicated. Others wavered, their loyalty metrics beginning a slow climb as they realized how thoroughly they'd been played. I offer clemency, Cassian announced. To any who lay down arms and swear renewed fealty before sunset tomorrow. Your titles remain. Your lands remain. Only Malaker's corruption will be purged. The throne room erupted into chaos. Malaker shouted over the din, calling Cassian a liar, but the damage was done. The interface showed the rebellion cohesion dropping from 78% to 41% in minutes. 3 of the 7 red markers turned yellow, wavering. Cassian rose. The offer expires with tomorrow's dusk. Choose wisely. He left the throne room, his guards forming a protective cordon. In his private chambers, he activated the full strategic overlay. Malaker's forces were converging on the Duke's ancestral fortress, Blackstone Keep. A sensible defensive position, thick walls, limited approaches, ample supplies. But Cassian had been studying fortress designs through the interface's siege engineering module for weeks. Blackstone had a weakness, its water supply came from an underground aquifer accessible through a network of ancient mining tunnels. Tunnels the interface's resource node vision had mapped when Cassian was searching for mineral deposits. He summoned General Arcturus. The grizzled veteran arrived within minutes, his armor still bearing scuffs from the Viridia campaign. Malaker will hole up in Blackstone, Cassian said, projecting the fortress schematic through the interface's holographic display. He expects a siege. We won't give him one. Arcturus studied the tunnels marked in blue. The old silver mines. They're unstable, Your Majesty. Only in certain sections. Cassian highlighted 3 routes. Engineering teams can shore them up within 48 hours. Meanwhile, we make a show of preparing siege engines at the main gate. He activated the morale scan. Malaker's troops showed high confidence, 85%, but their cohesion was already fracturing. The Duke had promised them plunder from imperial stores, but Cassian's economic reforms meant those stores were better guarded than Malaker anticipated. Over the next 2 days, Cassian watched the rebellion unravel. For nobles accepted the pardon, their yellow markers turning green as they publicly denounced Malaker. Their troops dispersed back to their estates. Malaker was left with 3,000 men, still dangerous, but manageable. On the 3rd morning, Cassian led the Imperial legions to Blackstone. The fortress rose from the rocky hills like a jagged tooth, banners bearing Malaker's hawk sigil snapping in the wind. Siege engines lined the Imperial camp, catapults, battering rams, towers. All decoys. While Malaker's defenders watched the main force, Cassian's elite troops moved through the tunnels. The interface provided real-time positioning, showing each squad's progress through the underground maze. Cassian stood on a command hill, the fortress visible in the distance, the interface overlaying tactical data across his vision. At noon, the attack began. Not with siege engines, but with explosions from within. Cassian's sappers had placed charges at key structural points, not enough to collapse the fortress, but enough to breach the inner courtyard gates. Chaos erupted on the walls. Malaker's defenders scrambled to respond to threats from multiple directions. The interface showed enemy morale plummeting from 85% to 32% in minutes. Cassian gave the order. Imperial troops poured through the breaches. He watched through the combat simulator module, predicting resistance points and redirecting forces accordingly. The battle was brutal but brief. Malaker's troops, already demoralized by the betrayal of their allies and the sudden internal attack, broke within 2 hours. Cassian entered Blackstone's great hall as the last resistance was crushed. Malaker stood before his shattered throne, sword in hand, surrounded by a dozen loyalists. You think you've won? Malaker spat. You've only made more enemies. The other kingdoms see what you are, a monster who destroys tradition. Tradition that starves children, Cassian said quietly. He didn't draw his own sword. He didn't need to. Arcturus's troops had crossbows trained on every rebel. Tradition that lines your pockets while peasants die in ditches. Malaker lunged. Cassian didn't move. 3 crossbow bolts took the Duke in the chest, shoulder, and thigh. He collapsed, gasping, his blood spreading across the stone floor. Cassian approached, looking down at the dying man. Your corruption ends here. Your name will be remembered only as a warning. He turned to Arcturus. Secure the fortress. Treat wounded prisoners according to imperial law. The rebellion is over. As he walked through the captured halls, the interface updated status markers. Noble class loyalty, which had plummeted to 39% after the Shadow Blade's attack, now climbed to 67%. The public exposure of Malakur's crimes, combined with the merciful treatment of those who surrendered, had shifted perception. Fear remained, but it was now tempered with reluctant respect. Gold reserves, which had dropped to 52% after dismantling the Assassination Guild, stabilized at 55%, confiscating Malakur's hidden treasuries would push that higher in coming days. Imperial territory cohesion improved from 71% to 84% with the rebellion crushed. Cassian allowed himself a moment in Blackstone's highest tower, looking out over lands now firmly under his control. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of orange and purple. For the first time in months, no immediate threat pulsed on his interface. Then the alert appeared. Not a subtle notification, but a system-wide warning that flashed crimson across his vision. Grand Alliance formed. Cassian's breath caught. The interface expanded the alert, displaying 3 kingdom sigils now linked by a glowing alliance marker: the Kingdom of Viridia's remnants under a new warlord, the Kingdom of Thalasser to the west with its powerful navy, and the Mountain Kingdom of Durnhold with its impregnable fortresses. Their combined military strength metrics scrolled, numbers that dwarfed his own forces. Diplomacy analyzer data flowed beneath, trade embargoes being coordinated, troop movements converging on shared borders, communication intercepts showing coordinated planning sessions. Cohesion, 73% and rising. Primary objective, remove the Cassian threat permanently. Cassian leaned against the cold stone of the tower, the sunset's beauty suddenly meaningless. He'd crushed internal threats, expanded his territory, stabilized his economy. And in doing so, he'd terrified every remaining rival into uniting against him. The war wouldn't be against fractured rebels or corrupt nobles. It would be against 3 organized kingdoms with combined resources, shared intelligence, and a singular purpose: his destruction. The interface's countdown timer, the one that had haunted him since awakening as Cassian, still showed 247 days until his prophesied assassination. But now a new timer appeared beneath it: estimated alliance invasion, 30 to 60 days. Cassian closed his eyes, the data still visible behind his eyelids. He'd been playing a complex game against multiple opponents, and they'd just formed a coalition. The rules had changed. The stakes had multiplied. When he opened his eyes again, his expression was calm, focused. The cold calculation returned. 3 kingdoms. 1 year. 1 emperor. He began running simulations. The war room was a cavernous space of stone and iron, its walls lined with maps that now seemed woefully inadequate. Emperor Cassian stood before the central table, his fingers tracing invisible lines in the air as the God's Eye interface painted the continent in translucent overlays of data. The Grand Alliance's forces glowed with ominous red icons: 30,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, siege engines being assembled in 3 separate staging grounds. The numbers pulsed with a rhythmic certainty that made his advisors shift uneasily behind him. General Arcturus cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Your Majesty, the combined host outnumbers our standing forces 2 to 1. Even with the Viridian auxiliaries, we cannot match them in open field. We must fortify the river crossings, hold the mountain passes. Cassian didn't turn. His eyes remained fixed on the interface, where supply lines spiderwebbed across the landscape. The logistics optimization skill required complete resource mapping, and for the past 3 days, he'd been feeding it data: granaries, armories, forges, every cache and stockpile in the Empire. Now the system hummed with potential, showing him routes and timetables that defied conventional wisdom. Defense is surrender, Cassian said, his voice quiet but carrying. They expect us to cower behind walls. They've planned for that. He expanded a section of the interface, and the room seemed to inhale sharply as 3-dimensional terrain models sprang to life. The Ironwood Pass, a narrow defile between sheer cliffs. The Silverflow River, shallow enough for fording in 3 specific locations. The Whispering Plains, where the grass grew tall enough to conceal movement. Each location glowed with tactical annotations: choke points, ambush sites, lines of retreat. We don't need to match their numbers, Cassian continued, finally turning to face his council. We need to be in the right place before they are. And we need to hit harder than they expect. He activated the Tech Surge protocol, The interface flickered, then displayed schematics for recurve crossbows with improved draw mechanisms, capable of punching through plate armor at 200 paces. Cavalry formations designed for hit-and-run tactics, using lighter armor for increased mobility. The research timelines compressed before their eyes, weeks of development collapsing into days as the system rerouted artisans, allocated materials, and optimized workshop layouts. The forges in Steelhaven can produce 200 of these crossbows per day if we divert iron from the northern mines, Cassian said, pointing to a resource node that glowed with untapped potential. The cavalry drills will begin tomorrow at dawn. I want every horseman practicing the new formations until they can execute them in their sleep. Lord Valerius, recently pardoned and still wearing the uncertain expression of a man who'd narrowly avoided execution, spoke up. Your Majesty, even with better weapons and tactics, the Alliance has 3 kingdoms pouring their treasuries into this war. They can afford to lose battles. We cannot. Cassian's smile was thin and sharp. Then we'll make sure they're fighting each other instead of us. He called up the diplomacy analyzer, and the interface populated with personality profiles of the Alliance leaders: King Alaric of Thalasser, proud and impulsive; Queen Maris of Durnhold, cautious and suspicious; General Torvin of the Viridian Remnants, bitter and ambitious. Their loyalty scores to the Alliance flickered between 65% and 78%, fragile connections held together by fear of Cassian's growing power. For the next hour, Cassian dictated a series of messages. False troop movements suggesting he planned to strike Thalasser's coastal cities first. Fabricated intelligence reports claiming Durnhold was negotiating a separate peace. Exaggerated accounts of Viridian commanders insulting their allies' competence. Each message was tailored to exploit the specific insecurities the interface revealed, then sent through channels he knew the Alliance would intercept. As the sun climbed toward noon, Cassian moved to the logistics planning. The optimization skill came alive, showing him supply routes that bypass traditional roads, using game trails and dry riverbeds. It calculated exactly how much grain could be moved per wagon, how many arrows each archer would need for a week of fighting, where to position field hospitals for maximum efficiency. He issued orders in a steady stream, and scribes scrambled to record them, their quills scratching frantically on parchment. By evening, the Empire was mobilizing with a precision that felt supernatural. In the capital's armories, smiths worked through the night on the new crossbow designs, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and oil. In the training yards, cavalry captains drilled their units on the new tactics, horses wheeling in complex patterns that left clouds of dust hanging in the twilight. Along the border, scouts moved into position, their reports feeding back into the interface in real time, adjusting the strategic picture minute by minute. Cassian stood on the palace's highest balcony as night fell, watching the city below. Lanterns glowed in windows, and the forges of the military district burned bright against the darkness. The interface showed him the Empire's vital signs: gold reserves holding steady at 55%, noble loyalty at 67% and climbing, military readiness improving from 42% to 68% in a single day. The machine of war was awakening, and he could feel its vibrations through the stone beneath his feet. Then the interface flashed crimson. A new alert pulsed in the corner of his vision, urgent and insistent. Cassian focused on it, and the world seemed to contract to that single point of data. Assassination plot, final gambit, detected. The alert expanded, revealing details that turned the night air cold. The Grand Alliance hadn't just raised armies. They'd hired killers, not the Shadow Blades with their theatrical infiltrations, but something worse. Professional battlefield assassins, specialists in eliminating commanders during the chaos of combat. The interface showed their icons already moving, blending with mercenary companies hired by the Alliance. 3 of them, each with a kill count in the dozens, each paid enough gold to buy a small town. Their profiles scrolled past his eyes. Varek, known for using poison bolts from extreme range. Kalen, not his servant, a different man with the same name, who specialized in close-quarters kills during melees. Soria, who disguised herself as a camp follower to get near her targets. Their estimated time to engagement, concurrent with the main battle. Their success probability against an alerted target, still 34%. Cassian's hands tightened on the balcony railing, the stone rough against his palms. He could almost feel the crosshairs settling on his back, the invisible threads of conspiracy drawing tight. The coming battle wouldn't just be armies clashing on a field. It would be a duel within a war, his strategic genius against their targeted violence. Below him, the Empire continued its preparations, unaware of this new threat. Torches moved along the walls as guards changed shifts. A wagon train loaded with grain rumbled through the main gate, heading for the front. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 killers were moving toward him, and the interface could only tell him they were coming, not exactly when, not exactly where. He stayed on the balcony long after the moon rose, watching the stars and the flickering lights of his waking empire, feeling the weight of the coming storm settle on his shoulders. The war had just become personal. Dawn broke over crimson fields with the metallic taste of impending bloodshed. Emperor Cassian stood atop the command hill, his breath forming pale clouds in the chill morning air. Below him, the Imperial army stretched across the valley like a living tapestry of steel and leather, their banners snapping in the wind. To the north, the Grand Alliance forces emerged from the morning mist, a dark tide of Viridian remnants, Thalasser Marines, and Durnhold heavy infantry, their numbers swelling across the horizon. Cassian's God's Eye interface flickered to life before his eyes. Translucent overlays painted the battlefield in strategic data, blue markers for his own units, red for the enemy, yellow for terrain features. Real-time metrics scrolled down the right side of his vision, Imperial forces 42,800, Alliance forces 58,200. Morale, Imperial 71%, Alliance 68%. Estimated casualty projection, 38 to 42% for both sides if engagement proceeded conventionally. Not today, Cassian thought, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. The first horn sounded from the Alliance lines, deep, mournful blasts that echoed through the valley. Their center advanced, a solid wall of Durnhold pikemen moving with mechanical precision. On the flanks, Thalasser skirmishers darted forward like silverfish, their light armor glinting in the rising sun. Viridian cavalry formed up on the eastern edge, their horses stamping impatiently. General Arcturus stood beside Cassian, his grizzled face grim. "They're committing everything to the center, Your Majesty. Trying to break us with sheer weight." Cassian nodded, his eyes fixed on the interface. The tactical overlay skill activated with a mental command, and the battlefield transformed into a chessboard of probabilities. Blue lines traced potential troop movements, red arrows showed enemy vectors, and glowing weak points appeared along the Alliance lines where coordination metrics dipped below 60%. The mental strain was immediate, a sharp pressure behind his eyes, like ice picks digging into his skull. "They're leaving their western flank exposed," Cassian said, his voice calm despite the pounding in his temples. "See how the Thalasser skirmishers are drifting east. Their commander is overcompensating for Viridian cavalry positioning." Arcturus squinted. "I don't see." "Trust the data," Cassian cut him off. "Order the 3rd Legion to hold the center but yield ground slowly. I want them to think they're breaking through. Move the 5th Legion to reinforce the western ridge, quietly, through the gullies. And have the crossbow companies ready on my signal." The battle erupted with the crash of steel on steel. Imperial lines met the Alliance advance along a front half a mile wide. The sound was deafening, shouts of commanders, screams of the wounded, the rhythmic thud of shield walls colliding. Cassian's interface updated in real time, Imperial casualties, 342, Alliance casualties, 289. Morale shifts flickered, Imperial down to 69%, Alliance holding at 67%. For 2 hours, the line seesawed. The Durnhold pikemen pushed forward, their discipline formidable. Imperial infantry gave ground in measured retreats, following Cassian's precise orders relayed through signal flags and mounted messengers. The interface showed the strain, his personal stamina dropping from 85% to 62% from maintaining the tactical overlay. Gold reserves ticked down from 55% to 51% as ammunition and medical supplies were consumed. Then the moment arrived. The interface highlighted a coordination gap in the Alliance center, a 200-yard section where Durnhold and Viridian units were failing to synchronize their advances, their coordination metric plummeting to 41%. Cassian deactivated the tactical overlay, the sudden release of mental pressure making him stagger briefly. "Now," he said to Arcturus. "Signal the cavalry." Imperial horns blared a new sequence, 3 short bursts, 1 long. From behind the command hill, Cassian's personal cavalry emerged, 800 strong. They weren't traditional heavy knights but something new, light cavalry armed with the recurve crossbows developed through tech surge, their armor streamlined for speed over protection. Cassian mounted his own warhorse, a black stallion bred for battle. He activated combat boost, and the world sharpened. Colors grew more vivid, sounds crisper, his own muscles humming with enhanced strength and reaction time. The cost was brutal, his stamina dropped another 15% immediately, and he felt the familiar ache of overtaxed systems. "With me," he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. The cavalry charge descended the hill like a thunderbolt. Cassian led from the front, his interface projecting optimal paths through the chaotic battlefield. They hit the exposed section of the Alliance line at full gallop. Crossbow bolts flew first, a volley that punched through gaps in the enemy formation. Then they were among them, swords flashing. Cassian fought with calculated fury. His interface highlighted threats, a Durnhold pikeman lunging from the left, a Viridian axeman swinging from the right. He parried the pike, sidestepped the axe, and cut down both men with precise strokes. Around him, his cavalry carved through the disorganized Alliance troops. Morale metrics on his HUD showed the impact. Imperial morale jumped to 74%, Alliance morale plummeted to 55%. The breakthrough rippled through the entire battle line. With their center collapsing, Alliance flanks began to waver. The Lasser skirmishers on the west found themselves flanked by the Imperial 5th Legion that had crept through the gullies. Viridian cavalry, committed too early to support the failing center, were caught in a crossfire from repositioned crossbow companies. Cassian fought until his arms burned and his breath came in ragged gasps. Combat boost faded, leaving him drained and trembling. He pulled back to the command hill, his cavalry reforming around him. Below, the battle had turned decisively. Alliance forces were retreating in disarray, first in pockets, then entire regiments breaking and fleeing northward. The interface updated, Imperial casualties, 8,421, Alliance casualties, 14,308. Military readiness dropped from 68% to 52%. Gold reserves, 48%. But they had won. The Grand Alliance's invasion was broken at Crimson Fields. Cassian dismounted, his legs unsteady. Arcturus approached, his armor splattered with blood but his eyes bright. A masterstroke, Your Majesty. They'll be years recovering from this. Before Cassian could respond, his interface flashed a crimson alert. Not the standard tactical warnings, but a specialized marker he'd programmed for the final gambit plot. 3 stealth signatures, nearly invisible against the battlefield chaos, were moving through the retreating forces. Their stealth metrics showed 89%, 91%, and 94%, professional killers using the confusion as cover. Varek. Kalen. Soria. The assassins weren't waiting for a clean shot from distance or disguise. They were coming now, through the carnage, while Imperial forces celebrated and guards were distracted by securing prisoners and tending wounded. Cassian's hand went to his sword. His stamina read 31%, too low to activate combat boost again. The interface tracked the 3 signatures moving with terrifying efficiency, skirting skirmishes, using smoke from burning supply carts as cover, closing the distance to the command hill. Your Majesty. Arcturus asked, noticing the sudden tension. Form a perimeter, Cassian said quietly, his eyes scanning the battlefield below. Tell the guards to watch for individuals moving against the flow of retreat. And ready my personal escort. Assassins? Close now, Cassian said, watching the 3 red dots on his HUD advance through the sea of retreating blue and red markers. They've been waiting for this moment, when victory makes us drop our guard. He could almost feel them out there in the smoke and chaos, 3 elite killers with one purpose. The battle might be won, but the war for his survival had just entered its most dangerous phase. The command tent smelled of blood, sweat, and damp earth. Emperor Cassian stood over the map table, his fingers tracing the lines of retreat the Grand Alliance forces had taken. The God's Eye interface hovered before him, translucent blue displays showing casualty reports, supply routes, and the flickering positions of scattered enemy units. His own stamina bar glowed a concerning amber at 31%, pulsing faintly with each heartbeat that echoed too loudly in his ears. Outside, the aftermath of the Battle of Crimson Fields unfolded in groans and shouted orders. Medical tents overflowed with wounded soldiers, their pained cries carried on the evening wind that whispered through the tent flaps. Torches cast long, dancing shadows across the canvas walls, and the distant clatter of armor being collected mingled with the crackle of campfires. Cassian's personal guard, a dozen hand-picked veterans, stood at attention around the perimeter, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. He should have felt triumph. The Alliance army had broken, their coordinated assault shattered by his cavalry charge and the devastating crossbow volleys. But the interface showed the cost too clearly, 8,421 Imperial soldiers dead or wounded, military readiness plummeting from 68% to 52%, gold reserves bleeding away to 48%. And beneath those numbers, a more immediate threat pulsed in red at the edge of his vision, 3 hostile markers moving through the camp's periphery, their stealth ratings climbing as they approached the command hill. Varek. Kalen. Soria. The final gambit assassins. Cassian's hand went to the hilt of his sword, the leather-wrapped grip familiar yet alien in Emperor Cassian's larger palm. Max's memories of gaming tournaments felt distant now, replaced by the visceral reality of a body that had just led a cavalry charge, muscles aching with fatigue, lungs still burning from exertion. The interface wasn't a game HUD anymore, it was the difference between breathing and bleeding out on this tense floor. He activated morale scan. The guard's loyalty ratings glowed green, all above 85%. Good. But the assassin's markers were closer now, slipping between patrols with unnatural grace. Soria's icon showed she'd adopted a disguise, probably Imperial armor scavenged from the dead. Verek's indicated he carried ranged poison weapons. Kalen's pulsed with close-quarters lethality. Your Majesty. General Arcturus stepped into the tent, his armor dented and blood-smeared. The grizzled veteran's loyalty read 92%, unwavering despite the day's carnage. The field is secure. We've taken 2,000 prisoners. Their commanders fled east toward. Later, Cassian cut him off, his eyes never leaving the interface. The 3 red markers had reached the inner perimeter. Sound the alarm. Assassins in the camp. Arcturus didn't question. He turned, bellowing orders that sent guards scrambling. But it was already too late. The tent flap to Cassian's left rippled, not from wind, but from a blade slicing through canvas. Kalen exploded through the opening, twin daggers flashing in the torchlight. The assassin moved with terrifying speed, a blur of leather and steel aimed straight for Cassian's throat. Time seemed to slow. Or rather, the interface did. Cassian's mind screamed with overload as the HUD flooded with data, attack vectors calculated, Kalen's momentum analyzed, guard positions updated. His body reacted before conscious thought could form, twisting aside as the left dagger grazed his shoulder plate. The scrape of metal on metal shrieked in the confined space. He didn't have an emergency evasion skill listed in his inventory. But he had something better, the interface's real-time processing combined with every combat prediction algorithm he'd ever min-maxed in strategy games. His body moved with precision born of data, not instinct, but calculation. Left guard, low thrust. Cassian shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos as he parried Kalen's follow-up strike. The nearest Imperial guard reacted, his sword intercepting where the interface predicted Kalen would pivot. Steel clashed, sparks flying. But Verek struck from the shadows at the tent's rear. No blade this time, a thin dart hissed through the air, its tip glistening with something that made the interface flash a toxic warning overlay. Cassian dropped into a crouch, the dart embedding itself in the map table where his neck had been. The wood sizzled where poison met oak. Poisoner at 6 o'clock. Cassian barked, rolling behind the table as another dart thudded into the ground where he'd been. His heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline warring with the bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to drag him down. The interface's displays flickered, mental strain warnings appearing as he maintained multiple skill activations simultaneously. Soria entered last, not through a cut opening but walking calmly through the main entrance dressed as an Imperial messenger. Her loyalty rating showed 0%, but her disguise held until she was 3 paces inside. Then she shed the pretense, a short sword appearing from beneath her cloak as she lunged toward Cassian's exposed flank. 3 against 1. In a tent crowded with guards now shouting and trying to intercept, but the assassins had chosen their moment perfectly, the confusion after battle, the exhaustion of victory, the natural lapse in vigilance. Cassian's mind raced through options. Combat Simulator ran scenarios in milliseconds. If he took Kalen head-on, Verek would poison him. If he dodged Soria, Kalen would gut him. If he called for guards to shield him, the assassins would simply kill the guards first. They were elite, their skill ratings glowing crimson in the interface, all above 80% in their respective specialties. Then he saw it, a pattern in their movements. Not coordination, but competition. Each assassin moved to claim the kill for themselves, their paths occasionally crossing in ways that created brief openings. The interface highlighted the gaps in red-tinted overlays, microseconds where one blocked another's line of attack, moments where their focus shifted to avoid colliding. He didn't fight them. He herded them. Ducking under Kalen's swinging dagger, Cassian shoved the map table toward Verek's position. The assassin had to sidestep, his next poison dart going wide and striking a tent pole instead. That movement put Verek directly in Soria's charge path, she had to check her lunge to avoid her ally, her sword swinging wide. Guards, formation delta. Cassian commanded, his voice steady despite the burn in his lungs. The interface transmitted the order not as words but as tactical data to the guards' positions. They responded instantly, 6 moving to encircle Kalen, 4 intercepting Soria, 2 charging toward Verek's last known position. But Verek was already moving, scaling the tent's interior frame with spider-like agility to gain elevation. Another dart hissed downward. Cassian threw himself sideways, feeling the projectile tear through his cloak and graze his ribs. Not deep, but fire immediately spread from the wound, the poison taking effect. The interface flashed a health warning, minor envenomation. Neurotoxin detected. Stamina drain accelerating. His stamina bar dropped, 31%. 28%. 25%. Kalen broke through the guard cordon, a dagger finding a seam in one soldier's armor. The man fell with a choked cry, but his sacrifice gave Cassian the opening he needed. As Kalen pulled the dagger free, Cassian was already moving, his own sword, Emperor Cassian's ornate but functional blade, driving upward in a thrust the interface calculated would bypass Kalen's guard. The assassin twisted at the last moment, the blade slicing through his side instead of his heart. He snarled, backhanding Cassian across the face with a gauntlet fist. Stars exploded behind Cassian's eyes, the interface flickering dangerously as his concentration wavered. Your Majesty! Arcturus buelled through the tent entrance, his greatsword cleaving the air where Soria had been standing. She danced back, but into the waiting blades of 2 more guards. Steel met steel in a cacophony of clashes. Verek fired again from above. This time Cassian didn't dodge, he predicted. The interface showed the dart's trajectory before Verek even released it. Cassian raised his vambrace, the dart embedding itself in the reinforced leather instead of his throat. The poison wouldn't penetrate to skin. But the action left him open. Kalen lunged, daggers aimed for his kidneys. Cassian did the only thing left, he dropped his sword. The move was so unexpected that Kalen hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Cassian to grab the assassin's wrist mid-thrust, using Kalen's own momentum to spin him around. Verek's next dart, aimed at Cassian, struck Kalen in the shoulder instead. The assassin's eyes widened in shock, then pain as the poison took immediate effect. He staggered, his daggers falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Cassian didn't wait, he drove his knee into Kalen's stomach, then shoved the choking assassin toward Verek's position. Verek had to abandon his perch to avoid the collapsing body, dropping to the tent floor just as Arcturus' greatsword came down in a sweeping arc. The assassin rolled, but not fast enough, the blade caught his leg, shearing through leather and flesh. Verek screamed, a sound cut short as 2 guards fell upon him with brutal efficiency. Soria was the last. She'd killed 1 guard and wounded another, but now she stood surrounded, blood dripping from her sword. Her eyes met Cassian's across the tent, and for a moment he saw not hatred, but professional assessment. She was calculating odds, escape routes, final options. The interface showed her loyalty to the Alliance at 71%, not fanatical, but contractual. Her survival instinct, however, glowed at 89%. Stand down, Cassian said, his voice ragged. You won't get out of here alive. Soria's gaze flickered to the tent entrance, where more guards were pouring in. To the bodies of her fellow assassins. To Cassian, bleeding from his poisoned wound but still standing, still commanding. Her sword arm lowered slightly. Then she moved, not toward Cassian, but toward the torn canvas where Kalen had entered. She was fast, impossibly fast, a blur of motion that should have carried her to freedom. But Cassian had already activated combat prediction. The interface showed him where she would be in 2 seconds, the path she would take, the guard she would bypass. He didn't chase her. He threw his discarded sword. Not as a weapon, but as an obstacle. The blade spun through the air, not aimed at Soria, but at the ground before her escape route. She had to leap over it, her momentum broken for a critical half-second. Arcturus' fist caught her in the temple as she landed. The crack was audible. Soria crumpled, unconscious before she hit the ground. Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing and the moans of the wounded. The tent was a ruin, canvas torn, furniture shattered, bodies littering the floor. 3 guards dead, 2 more injured. And the 3 assassins, Kalen dead from his own ally's poison, Verek bleeding out from his severed leg, Soria unconscious but alive. Cassian's legs buckled. He caught himself on the overturned map table, his vision swimming. The poison from the grazing wound burned along his ribs, his stamina bar now at 19% and dropping slowly. The interface flashed warnings about toxin accumulation, recommending antitoxins he didn't have on hand. Physician. Arcturus bellowed, catching Cassian before he could fall. The Emperor is wounded. Hands guided him to a stool that hadn't been smashed. Someone pressed a water skin to his lips. The water tasted like metal and dust. Cassian's hands trembled as he examined the wound, a shallow cut, but the skin around it was already discoloring, tendrils of black creeping outward. The interface identified the poison as Shadow Fang, a neurotoxin that caused progressive paralysis. Fatal if untreated within hours. Get the medical supplies from my personal chest, Cassian managed through gritted teeth. Green vial. Antitoxin base. A guard rushed to obey. Cassian focused on breathing, on keeping his heart rate steady to slow the poison spread. The interface helpfully displayed a timer, estimated time to systemic failure, 3 hours, 42 minutes. Arcturus knelt before him, his grizzled face etched with concern. We should never have let them get this close. I failed you, Your Majesty. You didn't, Cassian said, his voice stronger than he felt. They were professionals. Hired specifically because they could get through normal security. He looked at the bodies being dragged from the tent. The Alliance's final gambit. They knew they couldn't beat us on the field, so they tried to cut off the head. The guard returned with the green vial. Cassian uncorked it with trembling fingers, drinking the bitter liquid in one swallow. The interface showed the antitoxin's effect immediately, the timer jumped to 8 hours, 15 minutes. Not a cure, but a suppression. He'd need proper treatment soon. As the physician arrived and began cleaning his wound, Cassian's mind already turned to the next problem. The Alliance army was broken but not destroyed. Their commanders had fled. They would regroup somewhere, make a last stand. The tent flap burst open again, but this time it was a scout, mud-spattered and breathing hard. He dropped to one knee before Cassian, not even waiting for permission to speak. Your Majesty. News from the east. The Alliance remnants, they've fallen back to Thalasser's capital. They're fortifying the city, calling in every reserve. Our forward scouts estimate they'll be ready to defend within days. Cassian closed his eyes. Of course. Thalasser's capital, the strongest fortress in the Alliance, with walls that had never been breached. They'd make their final stand there, hoping to bleed his army dry against stone and steel. The scout continued, his voice urgent. And there's more. Our agents report the Thalassarian king is rallying the civilian population. He's declared this a fight for survival. Every man, woman, and child who can hold a weapon will be on those walls. Arcturus cursed softly. A siege, then. Against a fortified city with the entire population mobilized. It could take months. Our supplies wouldn't last, Cassian finished for him. He looked at the scout. How long before they're fully prepared? 3 days, maybe 4. They're working day and night. 3 days. With a poisoned wound slowly sapping his strength. With an army tired from today's battle. With supplies already strained. The interface displayed the projections. A conventional siege had a 23% chance of success before winter set in. An assault had 41% but would cost at least 15,000 more lives. Cassian pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the physician's protest. The wound in his side pulled taut, fresh blood seeping through the bandage. His stamina read 17% now, the number pulsing ominously. Then we don't give them 3 days, he said, his voice low but carrying through the ruined tent. We march at dawn. Arcturus stared at him. Your Majesty, with respect, you're wounded. The men are exhausted. The logistics alone will be handled, Cassian interrupted. He activated the interface's logistics optimization skill, feeling the mental strain as it began calculating supply routes, march times, fatigue recovery rates. The numbers scrolled past his vision, possible, but barely. They'd have to travel light, move fast, strike before the Alliance fully organized. He looked at the scout. Send word to the cavalry commanders. I want every mounted unit ready to ride at first light. The infantry will follow at forced march pace. To do what, Your Majesty? Arcturus asked, though his loyalty never wavered from its 92% glow. Cassian's gaze went to the eastern wall of the tent, as if he could see through canvas and distance to the fortified city waiting there. To the last organized resistance to his rule. To the final obstacle before his survival was assured. To end this, he said softly. Before they have time to make their walls a tomb for my army. Outside, the camp continued its grim work, burying the dead, treating the wounded, preparing for whatever came next. But in the command tent, surrounded by the bodies of would-be killers and the loyal soldiers who'd saved him, Emperor Cassian the Bloody, Max, the strategy champion from another world, knew the truth. The Battle of Crimson Fields had been won. The assassins had been stopped. But the war wasn't over. It would end at the Lasser's walls, one way or another. And he had 3 days to get there. The walls of the Lasser rose like jagged teeth against the dawn sky, black stone glistening with morning dew that caught the first light like scattered diamonds. Emperor Cassian sat astride his warhorse at the crest of a low hill, the God's Eye interface painting the city in layers of translucent data. Defender morale, 78%. Fortification integrity, 92%. Hidden traps detected, 47. The numbers floated before his eyes, a ghostly overlay on the physical reality of towers, battlements, and the faint movement of soldiers along the ramparts. His breath misted in the chill air. The poison wound in his shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that the antitoxin had only partially numbed. Stamina, 17%. The number glowed amber in his peripheral vision, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. Behind him, the Imperial army spread across the plains like a dark tide, 20,000 men, their armor catching the rising sun, their banners snapping in the cold wind that swept down from the northern mountains. "Your Majesty," General Arcturus said, his voice gravelly from years of command. The old warrior rode up beside him, his face lined with fatigue but eyes sharp as ever. "Scouts report the Alliance has concentrated all remaining forces here. They've sealed the gates, stockpiled supplies. They mean to make their last stand." Cassian nodded, his gaze never leaving the interface's display. Resource nodes within the city glowed faintly, granaries at 85% capacity, armories well-stocked, water sources secure. The defenders had prepared well. He could see the loyalty ratings of the garrison commanders floating above their presumed positions, ranging from 65% to as high as 91% for the captain of the Eastern Gate. These were not broken men making a desperate last stand, they were professionals who believed they could hold. "Order the engineers to begin constructing siege lines at 300 paces, Cassian said, his voice carrying the weight of command despite his exhaustion. "I want the trebuchets positioned here, here, and here." He pointed to 3 locations the interface had highlighted as optimal firing positions, where the terrain offered slight elevation and clear lines of fire to the wall's weakest sections. As the army began its methodical advance, Cassian activated the siege analyzer skill. The interface shimmered, data streams accelerating as it processed centuries of architectural knowledge, stress patterns in stone, weather erosion effects, and the subtle tells of recent repairs. The city walls, which had appeared impregnable moments before, now revealed their secrets in pulsing red and amber overlays. There, a section of the western wall where the mortar had degraded from decades of exposure to the salt-laden winds coming off the Silver Flow River. The stones there showed microfractures invisible to the naked eye. Another point on the southern curtain wall where a recent repair job had been done hastily, the new stones not properly bonded with the old. And the main gate itself, while reinforced with iron bands, had a structural weakness at the hinge mechanism that would fail under sustained impact. "Concentrate fire on these coordinates," Cassian said, transmitting the data through the interface to his artillery commanders. The mental effort made his head pound, and his stamina dipped to 16%. He pushed through it, focusing on the tactical overlay that showed his trebuchet crews moving into position, their progress tracked in real-time percentages. For 3 days, the siege unfolded with grim precision. Imperial trebuchets hurled stones the size of ox carts against the weakened sections of wall. Each impact sent tremors through the ground that Cassian could feel even at his command post half a mile back. The defenders responded with their own artillery, catapults mounted on the towers that sent flaming projectiles arcing toward the Imperial lines. The interface tracked each one, calculating trajectories and warning of incoming fire moments before it landed, allowing crews to scatter. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun sank in a bloody smear across the western sky, Cassian gathered his messengers. "Psychological warfare protocol," he ordered, and the interface activated its amplification matrix. The skill wasn't listed in his inventory by that name, but it functioned through a combination of diplomacy analyzer to craft the perfect message, morale scan to identify the defender's psychological pressure points, and what the interface simply labeled strategic communication optimization. His chosen herald, a young captain named Rylan with a voice that could carry across battlefields, rode to within shouting distance of the walls. Through the interface, Cassian fed him the words, each phrase calculated to undermine specific commanders' loyalty, to remind common soldiers of their families waiting in occupied territories, to offer honorable surrender with guaranteed safety. "People of Thalasser. Ryland's voice boomed, amplified by some trick of the interface that made it seem to come from everywhere at once. Your leaders have brought you to ruin. The Grand Alliance is shattered. Viridia has fallen to rebellion. Durnhold's armies have withdrawn. You fight alone for nobles who would sacrifice every last one of you to save their own skins. The interface showed the effect in real time. Defender morale, 78%. 74%. 71%. It dropped steadily over the next hour as Ryland repeated variations of the message, each tailored to different segments of the garrison based on their loyalty ratings and known backgrounds. Cassian watched as individual soldier icons along the walls flickered from steady green to uncertain yellow. That night, under cover of darkness, a dozen defenders attempted to desert, lowering themselves from the walls on ropes. The interface detected them immediately, and Cassian ordered them captured rather than killed. He had them brought before him at dawn, their faces pale with fear. You chose life over pointless death, Cassian said, his voice carrying no malice. Tell your comrades inside what you've seen. Tell them the Emperor offers mercy to those who lay down their arms. Tell them the truth, that their leaders have abandoned them. He sent them back to the walls with food and water, a calculated gesture the interface confirmed would have greater psychological impact than any threat. Defender morale dropped to 63% by midday. On the fifth day of the siege, the western wall finally gave way. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual crumbling as stone after stone dislodged from the weakened section. The interface showed the structural integrity dropping in rapid percentages, 42%. 31%. 19%. Then, with a groan that echoed across the battlefield, a 20-foot section of wall slumped inward, creating a jagged breach filled with dust and fallen masonry. Now, Cassian said, his voice tight with anticipation. Imperial horns sounded the advance. Heavy infantry moved forward in disciplined formations, shields locked, while archers provided covering fire. The interface provided real-time maps of the city's interior, streets, alleys, strongpoints, gleaned from pre-siege reconnaissance and updated with thermal scans showing defender concentrations. Cassian watched as blue Imperial icons flowed into the breach, meeting red defender icons in furious close-quarters combat. The fighting raged through the city's streets for hours. Cassian remained at his command post, monitoring everything through the interface's tactical overlay. He directed reserves to reinforce breakthroughs, identify defender fallback positions before they were established, and even pinpointed 3 attempted ambushes in the winding alleys of the merchant district. His stamina dropped to 15%, the poison wound burning with each concentrated use of the interface, but he pushed through, drinking bitter antitoxin drafts that only partially dulled the pain. By late afternoon, Imperial forces controlled the outer districts. The defenders had fallen back to the inner citadel, a fortified keep at the city's heart. Cassian ordered the advance paused, his interface showing the citadel's defenses, murder holes, boiling oil cauldrons, reinforced gates. Another direct assault would cost hundreds of lives. Bring forward the captured assassin, he commanded. Soria was dragged before him, her hands bound, the disguise of a common soldier long since discarded. She glared at him with undisguised hatred, but the interface showed her loyalty to the Grand Alliance at only 34%, the failed mission and abandonment by her employers had eroded her commitment. You know the Citadel's layout, Cassian said. The Alliance leaders are inside. Tell me how to get to them without slaughtering my men on the walls. She spat at his feet. I'd rather die. Cassian activated the diplomacy analyzer, the interface scanning her psychological profile, her values, her breaking points. The Grand Alliance is finished, he said, his voice calm, each word chosen based on the data streaming before him. Your employers are trapped in that keep, waiting to die. They sacrificed Varek and Kalen without a second thought. They'll sacrifice you too, if you ever mattered to them at all. He let the words hang in the air, watching as her loyalty rating flickered, 34%. 29%. 25%. Help me end this cleanly, he continued, and you walk away. Not as a prisoner. Not as a slave. You disappear, with enough gold to start anew somewhere the Alliance's reach can't find you. The interface showed the offer hitting its mark. Survival instinct warred with professional pride, and survival won. There's a sewer access in the eastern basement, Soria said finally, her voice defeated. It leads up through the old garderobe chutes into the servant passages. Poorly guarded. The nobles never think about where their shit goes. Cassian dispatched a hand-picked team of scouts through the route she described. The interface tracked their progress as they moved through the foul-smelling tunnels, emerging into the citadel's lower levels. Within an hour, they had secured a postern gate from the inside. The final assault began at dusk. Imperial troops poured through the opened gate while defenders were distracted by a feint at the main entrance. The interface showed the citadel's garrison collapsing as they were attacked from within and without simultaneously. Defender morale plummeted, 42%. 31%. 19%. Then mass surrenders began as soldiers threw down their weapons rather than die for a lost cause. Cassian entered the citadel as the last resistance was being mopped up. The halls were choked with the smell of blood and smoke. Wounded men groaned inside chambers. Imperial soldiers moved with methodical efficiency, securing rooms, disarming prisoners, following the real-time maps the interface provided to every officer. He climbed the central staircase to the throne room, his personal guard forming a protective cordon around him. His shoulder throbbed with each step, his stamina now at 14%. The antitoxin was wearing off, and he could feel the poison's cold tendrils spreading through his veins again. He pushed the sensation aside, focusing on the interface's alert that the Alliance leadership had been tracked to this chamber. The great doors to the throne room were barred from within. Cassian nodded to his guards, who used a battering ram to smash them open. The sound of splintering oak echoed through the corridor. Inside, the scene was one of grim finality. The throne room of Thalasser was a vast chamber of marble and gold, now lit by the dying light filtering through high stained glass windows. At the far end, on a dais, 3 figures sat slumped in ornate chairs arranged before the empty throne. Cassian recognized them from interface dossiers: Lord Valerius of Durnhold, his face pale in death, General Torvin of what remained of Viridia's military, a dagger still clutched in his hand, and the Thalasser regent himself, an old man named Silas who had ruled in the absent king's stead. All 3 were dead. Not from violence inflicted by others, but by their own hands. Valerius had taken poison, a dark vial still resting in his lap. Torvin had fallen on his sword, the blade protruding from his back. Silas had cut his own throat, the ceremonial dagger lying in a pool of blood that had soaked his rich robes. On a table between them rested a single document, a formal surrender, already signed with their names and seals. They had chosen to end the war on their own terms, surrendering their city but not their lives to the tyrant emperor. Cassian approached slowly, his boots echoing on the marble floor. The interface scanned the bodies, confirming no vital signs, no hidden traps, no lingering threats. Victory was complete. The Grand Alliance was broken. His path to conquering the continent before his assassination date was clear. He reached for the surrender document, his fingers inches from the parchment when the interface pinged with a sharp, urgent alert he had never seen before. The usual translucent displays flickered, replaced by a single line of text that glowed with ominous crimson light, pulsing like a heartbeat. Hidden message: the true threat awakens. Beneath it, for just a fraction of a second, another line appeared, coordinates that pointed not to any location on his maps of the known world, but to a blank area beyond the Western Ocean, and a timer counting down from 180 days. Then it vanished, leaving only the surrender document, the dead leaders, and the cold certainty that the game had just changed forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the imperial palace as Emperor Cassian stood surveying his capital. The translucent God's Eye interface hovered before his eyes, displaying numbers that would have made his predecessor weep with envy. Loyalty metrics across the empire: 89% in the core provinces, 72% in newly conquered territories, and climbing steadily. Resource nodes glowed green across the continent: iron from the northern mountains, grain from the central plains, gold from the western hills, all flowing into imperial coffers at 147% efficiency. The assassination countdown that had haunted him for months now read: time remaining, 6 months, 2 days, 14 hours. Cassian breathed deeply, the air tasting of victory and something else, the metallic tang of the poison still circulating in his system. His stamina hovered at 14%, a constant reminder of Varric's dart and the cost of using the interface at maximum capacity during the siege. He could feel the toxin like cold fingers tracing his veins, suppressed but not eliminated by the antitoxin. The physicians had warned him against further strain, but there was no time for convalescence. An empire won through blood and strategy could be lost through neglect in days. Below the palace walls, the capital stirred with unprecedented energy. Banners in imperial purple and gold hung from every building. Market stalls overflowed with goods from across the continent: Viridian silks, Lorati spices, Thalassarian seafood. The interface's economic modeling skill projected tax revenues increasing by 23% this quarter alone. Cassian watched through the interface's strategic reconnaissance as citizens moved through the streets, their loyalty percentages floating above their heads like invisible crowns. Most showed numbers in the high 80s or 90s, a far cry from the single-digit loyalties he'd inherited as Cassian the Bloody. "Your Majesty." General Arcturus approached, his armor polished to a mirror shine, though the old warrior moved with a slight stiffness from wounds taken at Crimson Fields. "The victory parade begins in 1 hour. The people have been gathering since dawn." Cassian nodded, activating the morale scan. The capital's collective morale registered at 94%, euphoric victory tempered by war weariness. "And the security arrangements?" "Triple-layered," Arcturus said. "Every rooftop along the procession route has crossbowmen. Every sewer entrance is sealed. Every food vendor has been vetted. The counterintelligence network skill you implemented has flagged 17 potential threats in the past week, all neutralized." The interface confirmed Arcturus's report with real-time data streams. Cassian could see the guard positions as blue dots on his tactical overlay, the crowd density as heat maps, even the structural integrity of buildings along the parade route. After months of constant warfare, this meticulous planning felt almost peaceful. "Let them see their emperor," Cassian said, turning toward his chambers. "Let them see the man who united the continent." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The roar of the crowd hit Cassian like a physical force as his golden chariot emerged from the palace gates. 50,000 voices chanting his name, not in fear as they once had, but in genuine adoration. Flower petals rained down from balconies. Children waved miniature imperial flags. The interface displayed loyalty spikes with each block he passed, 87% to 91% to 93%. Cassian stood straight in the chariot, his ceremonial armor glittering in the midday sun. The poison made his vision swim at the edges, but he kept his expression regal, nodding to left and right. His mind, however, was elsewhere, running multiple interface skills simultaneously. Plot detection scanned the crowd for traitors, only 3 yellow markers in this sea of green. Resource optimization calculated the parade's cost against the propaganda value, 12,000 gold spent, projected loyalty increase of 4% empire-wide. Diplomacy analyzer processed the crowd's emotional signatures, 85% genuine celebration, 10% curiosity, 5% residual fear. Halfway along the procession route, Cassian raised a hand. The chariot halted. The crowd fell silent, a wave of quiet spreading outward from the imperial presence. "People of the Empire." Cassian's voice, amplified by the interface's direct inspiration skill, carried to the farthest spectator. 1 year ago, I awoke to an empire crumbling from within, besieged from without. 1 year ago, assassins plotted in every shadow. 1 year ago, you looked upon your emperor with hatred in your hearts. He paused, letting the interface feed him the crowd's reaction, attention 99%, comprehension 87%. Today, we stand united. Today, the Grand Alliance lies broken. Today, every man, woman, and child from the northern glaciers to the southern deserts lives under one banner, one law, one future. The cheering erupted again, louder than before. Cassian watched loyalty percentages tick upward across his display. In the crowd, he spotted familiar faces, a baker whose shop he'd saved from corrupt tax collectors, a farmer whose lands he'd protected from marauding bandits, soldiers who'd fought beside him at Crimson Fields. Their loyalty registered at 100%, glowing like beacons. As the chariot moved on, Cassian activated the Empire stabilization skill. The interface demanded immense concentration, his stamina dropped to 12%, but the results unfolded before him like a master strategist's dream. Conquered territories appeared on his mental map, each with detailed reports, population density, resource allocation, cultural integration percentages. The skill automatically generated governance templates, matching loyal officials to regions based on their competencies. General Arcturus would oversee military integration in Thalasser. Newly promoted commanders from the Viridian campaign would administer the eastern provinces. Every appointment optimized for stability and growth. That evening, in the throne room transformed by victory, Cassian addressed the surviving nobility. The corrupt council had been purged months ago, but new faces filled the hall, governors from conquered lands, military commanders, trade representatives. The interface's loyalty purge skill ran silently in the background, flagging 3 nobles with suspicious financial connections to former alliance states. Lord Valerius, Cassian said, his eyes fixed on a wavering noble who'd nearly joined Duke Malachur's rebellion. Your lands border the newly acquired Thalassarian territories. The interface shows your agricultural yields are 40% below provincial average. The noble paled. Your Majesty, the soil is rich with volcanic ash, perfect for vineyards, Cassian interrupted, pulling data from the resource node vision. I'm appointing Vintner Corbin from Lorith to oversee conversion. Your revenues should triple within 2 years. Valerius's loyalty jumped from 61% to 79%. Similar scenes played out across the hall, Cassian diagnosing problems, prescribing solutions, binding each noble to the empire through enlightened self-interest. The interface's economic modeling projected empire-wide growth of 8% annually if reforms held. Later, alone in the war room, Cassian reviewed the consolidation. Maps covered the walls, not the patchwork of rival kingdoms from a year ago, but a unified continent painted imperial purple. The interface displayed the final numbers, military readiness recovering to 65%, gold reserves at 54% and climbing, tech advancement accelerating through the tech tree acceleration skill. The assassination countdown still ticked, but for the first time, Cassian felt its threat diminishing. He had survived. He had conquered. Then the interface flickered. A new marker appeared at the edge of the known world, beyond the Western Ocean where maps showed only blank spaces and sea monsters. The coordinates matched those from the cryptic alert after Thalasser's fall. The marker pulsed with ominous crimson light, and text scrolled across Cassian's vision, unknown entity, Demon Lord's Herald, spotted. Cassian's blood ran colder than the poison in his veins. He zoomed the interface's view, but the marker remained frustratingly distant, surrounded by data corruption, terrain, unknown, forces, unscannable, threat level, calculating. The 180-day timer from the original alert now read, time remaining, 179 days, 23 hours, 47 minutes. Outside, fireworks exploded over the capital, painting the night sky in imperial colors. The celebration would continue until dawn. But in the silent war room, Emperor Cassian stared at the pulsing crimson marker, understanding dawning like a winter sunrise. The Grand Alliance, the assassins, the year-long struggle for survival, all of it had been merely the opening moves. The true game was about to begin, and the board was larger than he'd ever imagined. His hand went unconsciously to the poisoned wound on his neck. 6 months until the assassination deadline. 180 days until, something else. Cassian activated the combat simulator skill, feeding it the limited data from the mysterious marker. The interface whirred through calculations before displaying a single percentage, victory probability with current forces, 12.7%. The fireworks outside reached their crescendo, but Cassian didn't hear them. His eyes remained fixed on that distant crimson pulse, watching as it beat like a heart across an ocean of darkness.